A woman walked into town with tattered shoes, penniless, and a letter promising a job, only to be told straight to her face that the job had ceased to exist months earlier. The landlady refused her entry. The grocery store owner turned away. The entire town watched a woman collapse in the muddy street, and no one moved. But one man, cold, solitary, burdened with his own pain, stepped out of the crowd. And that decision changed everything. Follow the story to the end, and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The stagecoach dropped her at the edge of Red Bluff like something it had accidentally picked up and no longer wanted. Clara Whitmore stepped down onto the wooden platform, if you could call 3 rotting planks lashed together a platform, and stood still for a moment, letting the dust settle around her boots. The boots were the worst of it, or at least the most visible part of the worst of it. The left sole had separated from the upper, and she'd wrapped it twice with a strip of burlap she'd torn from a feed sack 2 towns back. It held, mostly. If she didn't step wrong, she had a carpet bag. Inside it, 1 spare dress, a hairbrush missing 4 of its bristles, a tin of cold cream she'd been rationing since autumn, a folded letter, and 11 cents. She'd counted the coins that morning on the stage, pressing each one against her palm like they might mean something different if she felt them long enough. They didn't. 11 cents in Red Bluff, Montana was 11 cents anywhere else, which was to say it was almost nothing. The letter was what mattered. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds, the ink rubbing faint in places. Housekeeping position available. Room and board included. Inquire at Whitfield's General Store, Red Bluff, Montana. Immediate start. She'd found it pinned to a church board in Billings 3 weeks ago, and she'd taken it as a sign. Not the religious kind, she didn't put much stock in those anymore, but the practical kind. The kind that said, "Here is a door. Try it." She tried it. Red Bluff in late October was the color of old rust. The main street ran maybe 300 yards between a cluster of wooden storefronts before giving up and dissolving into open range. A barber shop, a saloon, a feed store, a land office with peeling paint on the sign. Whitfield's General Store sat in the middle of the block, wide-fronted, with a barrel of dried beans outside the door and a cat sleeping on top of it. Clara walked the length of the street without hurrying, even though her legs ached and she hadn't eaten since a half biscuit at the relay station outside of Coldwater the previous evening. Hurrying felt like something she couldn't afford. It would show too much. Desperation wore itself on the body before it ever reached the face. The bell above Whitfield's door announced her. The man behind the counter was heavy-set, somewhere between 50 and 60, with a gray beard clipped close and eyes that moved over her with the particular efficiency of a man who spent his days judging the quality of things. He took in the carpet bag, the burlap-wrapped boot, the dress that had been pressed carefully but was still a dress that had seen better years. "Help you?" he said. Clara set the letter on the counter between them, smoothed it once with her palm. "I'm here about the housekeeping position. I wrote ahead 3 weeks ago but didn't receive a reply, so I came in person. Clara Whitmore." He looked at the letter without touching it. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt, exactly. More like inconvenience. "That position," he said. "That was filled back in July." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Clara had learned to let silences sit rather than rushing to fill them with reassurance or apology, because reassurance and apology both cost something she didn't have. "July," she said. "Yep. Woman named Hartley. She's still there." He pushed the letter back toward her. "Sorry you made the trip." He didn't sound sorry. He sounded like a man who had already moved on to the next thing and was waiting for her to leave so he could get to it. Clara picked up the letter and folded it back along its creases. "Is there work here?" "Any work. I'm capable, I'm not particular, and I'll work for fair wages." "Depends on what you mean by capable." "Cooking, cleaning, sewing, laundry. I can manage accounts if needed. I've done field work." He studied her for a moment. "We don't got much call for extra help right now. Things are tight all over. You might try the saloon." The way he said it made clear what kind of work he meant. "I won't be trying the saloon," Clara said. "Thank you for your time." She walked out. The cat on the barrel opened one eye as she passed, then closed it again. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the thin autumn sun, and thought through her options. They were limited. The 11 cents wouldn't buy a meal and a night's lodging both. She had her dress she could maybe sell, but she was wearing it and had nothing to change into, so that was circular logic. She could try the other establishments on the street one by one, which she intended to do. She was not a woman who gave up while she still had legs under her. She tried the feed store. No. The barber shop. No. A woman who answered the door of a house at the end of the block, who looked her over and said they weren't hiring. A man unloading barrels from a wagon who said he did his own work, thank you. The land office, where a clerk in a too-tight vest told her they didn't employ women. By the time she'd covered the block twice, something had shifted in how the street felt. People were aware of her now. She'd been noticed. A pair of women outside the dry goods store tracked her progress with the particular focused attention that meant they were discussing her. Two men leaning on the hitching post outside the saloon watched with expressions that had nothing to do with sympathy. A woman came out of the mercantile, large-boned, well-dressed in the way of someone who wanted you to know it, and stopped directly in Claire's path. "You the one looking for work?" she said. "I am." "You come off that morning stage?" "I did." The woman looked her up and down the way you'd look at a horse you suspected was lame. "Where are you from?" "Most recently Billings." "And before that?" Claire met her eyes. "A few places." The woman seemed to make a decision. "Well, I run a clean establishment here, and I've got enough to manage without taking on strangers who show up with nothing but a bag and a sob story. Red Bluff's not a charity town." She said this as though she'd been asked to provide charity, which she hadn't. "I wasn't asking for charity," Claire said. "I was asking for work." "Same thing, when you've got nothing to offer." "I beg your pardon, Martha." A man nearby said it quietly, not to correct her exactly, more to remind her she had an audience. The woman, Martha, gave Clara one more long look, then turned and walked back into the mercantile. Clara stood on the boardwalk and breathed slowly for a moment. Her vision had gone slightly bright at the edges, which was what happened when she hadn't eaten and the cold started working into her. She hadn't slept well on the stage. The altitude here was higher than Billings, and she felt it in her chest when she breathed too fast. She would be fine. She was always fine. She had been in worse places than a cold street with 11 cents and a locked door. But her legs chose that moment to disagree. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden collapse, no graceful swoon. She simply sat down, abruptly, in the mud at the edge of the boardwalk, because her knees decided they were done for the moment, and that was the decision they made without consulting her. The carpetbag landed sideways in the street. The burlap wrapping on her boot finally came loose and trailed into the mud. She was aware distantly of the street going quiet around her, of people stopping. She tried to stand and found she couldn't quite manage it. Silas Mercer had come into town for grain and fence wire, same as he did every 2 or 3 weeks, and he'd been loading the wagon at the far end of the street when the stagecoach had arrived that morning. He hadn't paid it particular attention. He rarely paid town things particular attention. Red Bluff and its opinions had stopped being something he cared much about. Somewhere around the time his wife died, and the whole town had come to the funeral with their sympathetic faces and their covered dishes, and then started talking about his grief behind his back within the week. He'd been watching the woman from a distance, not intently, just aware of her in the way you were aware of something that didn't quite fit the ordinary pattern of a morning. She'd been going door to door with a straightness to her spine that told him she was exhausted and wasn't going to let anyone see it. He recognized that posture. He'd worn it himself. When she sat down in the mud, nobody moved. That was the thing that stuck in him like a splinter. Not her falling, but the 20 or so people on that street who all found reasons to look at the sky or their feet or the middle distance. Martha Holt folded her arms. Old Ray Jessup scratched his beard. 2 kids pressed against a storefront window and watched with the frank curiosity of children who hadn't yet learned to pretend they weren't looking. Silas finished tying off the canvas on his grain sacks, climbed down from the wagon, and walked up the street. He wasn't doing it out of charity particularly, or out of some great moral impulse. He was doing it because everyone else was doing nothing, and that bothered him more than the inconvenience of doing something. He crouched down beside her. She was conscious. Her eyes were open and tracking, jaw set, clearly furious with herself. "Can you stand?" he said. "I'm fine," she said immediately, which was clearly not true. I didn't ask if you were fine. I asked if you could stand. She looked at him, brown eyes, sharp even now. Not at this moment, no. All right. He picked up the carpet bag and then, because there was no other sensible way to do it, he put one arm under her shoulders and helped her to her feet. She was lighter than she should have been for a woman her height, and the realization sat uneasily with him. She stood, wavered once, and got her feet under her. Thank you, she said stiffly. When did you last eat? She didn't answer immediately. That was its own answer. There's a diner on the next block, Silas said. Come on. I'm not taking charity. I didn't offer any. I'm going to eat my lunch, and if you sit across from me and eat something too, that's your business. He started walking. After a moment, she followed. He heard Martha Holt say something behind them, but he didn't catch the words, and he didn't turn around. The diner was called May's, which was also what the woman who ran it was called. May was 60, built like someone had stacked rocks in a practical configuration, and she was one of maybe 4 people in Red Bluff whose company Silas found tolerable. She didn't ask questions, and she didn't soften things she didn't mean to soften. She looked at Clara the way she looked at most things, directly, without performance, and set a menu on the table without being asked. Silas ordered coffee and a beef plate. Clara studied the menu for a moment, and Silas watched her do the arithmetic he recognized, checking prices against whatever she had in her pocket. Get what you want, he said. I'm buying. I told you. You told me you're not taking charity. This is a business discussion, not charity. I have questions and you can answer them over food, or I can ask them on an empty stomach, which will take longer. He folded his hands on the table and waited. She ordered the stew. When it came, she ate carefully. Not slowly, but with a control that told him she was very hungry and was not going to let herself eat like she was very hungry. He watched that for a moment, then looked away because it felt like something private. You came in on the stage, he said. Yes. Looking for work. I saw you going door to door. The position I came for was filled months ago. The advertisement was still posted. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. What kind of work? Housekeeping, cooking, whatever needs doing. She looked at him directly. I'm not unskilled. I managed a boarding house in Kansas for 2 years. Before that, I worked a farm. I can do accounts. I can make things run. And the farm? Her expression didn't change much, but something in it shifted. That was a while back. It's not relevant. He didn't push it. He had things from a while back that weren't relevant either. I've got a ranch, he said. About 4 miles out. It's been not well managed recently. The house needs work. The books are a mess. He paused. I also have my nephew living with me. He's 8 years old. He doesn't talk much. Doesn't talk much or doesn't talk? Both, depending on the day. She was quiet for a moment, eating her stew. How long has he been with you? 7 months. His parents died in March. The family farm burned. Accident with a lamp. He was the only one in the barn at the time. Silas said it the way he'd learned to say it, flat and even, because the alternative was not useful to anyone. He was 7. He hasn't talked since. Clara set her spoon down. That's his response, and it makes sense, she said quietly. It wasn't a comment with any particular emotion attached to it, just a plain statement, like she was noting something she recognized. It was the first thing she'd said that surprised him. I'm not offering charity, he said. I'm offering work, board and room, fair wages, paid weekly. I'll put it in writing if you want. Matter of fact, I'd insist on it. Everything clear up front. He paused. It's a proper arrangement, business arrangement. She looked at him for a long moment. He had the feeling she was doing a different kind of arithmetic now, not prices, but risks. He understood that too. You live alone with the boy? She said. My ranch hand Hector comes by 3 days a week. My nearest neighbor, Tom Aldrich, is half a mile north. Town knows Hector, knows Tom. I'm not... He stopped. He wasn't going to explain himself like he was accused of something. If you want references, you can ask May, or the preacher, if that matters to you. Ask whoever you want to ask. She glanced over at May, who was wiping down the counter with a cloth and seemed entirely uninterested in their conversation, which was probably its own kind of testimony. Write it out, Clara said. The terms. He nodded. He asked May for paper. She produced a half sheet from behind the counter without comment, and he wrote out the terms in his plain, spare handwriting: room and board, weekly wages, the amount, expected duties. Either party could end the arrangement with 1 week's notice. He dated it and signed it and pushed it across the table. Clara read it all the way through. She made one small correction, changing cleaning and cooking to household management and cooking, which he found vaguely interesting. Then she signed her name, Clara M. Whitmore, the letters neat and even. "What's the M?" he said. "May," she said. "Different spelling." Real May, behind the counter, didn't look up, but appeared to find this amusing, judging by the corner of her mouth. Silas folded the paper and put it in his chest pocket. "Wagon's down the street. We can head out when you're ready." She was ready in 5 minutes. She asked to stop at the well to drink some water and wash her hands, and he waited. And then she climbed up onto the wagon seat with the carpet bag and sat straight despite the fact that she had to be exhausted. And they drove out of Red Bluff with Martha Holt watching from the mercantile steps, and 2 or 3 others noting their departure with varying degrees of visible opinion. Silas didn't say anything about the town's opinions. Neither did Clara. There was a companionable absence of talking for the first mile or so, which he appreciated. People who needed to fill every silence made him tired. The road north was rough. Late autumn had taken the easy ground out of it, and the wagon pitched and jolted over dried ruts. Clara gripped the seat without complaint and watched the country open up around them. The land out here was wide and bleak, and had a particular kind of beauty to it that required you to be paying attention or you'd miss it. The mountains were north, white at the peaks already, and the valley was brown and amber, and the sky was the flat, cold blue of October. "It's a big sky," Clara said eventually. "That's what people say." "Do you get tired of it?" He thought about it honestly. "No, I get tired of the winters, not the sky." She nodded, like that tracked with something. The ranch came into view after another 20 minutes. The main house first, 2 stories, with a porch that needed repair and a gate that hung at an angle because one hinge had given. Beyond it, the barn, the smaller outbuildings, the fenced pasture where a dozen cattle stood in the weak afternoon light. The place had good bones. That was the honest truth of it, even now. Good bones and a lot of neglect that had stacked up over the last year and a half. Clara looked at it without saying anything. "House needs work," Silas said. "I can see that." "I told you." "You did." She looked at the porch, the lopsided gate, the window on the upper right where the shutter was hanging by one hinge. "Good roof, though." "Roof solid. What about the floors?" "Main room's fine. Kitchen's got a soft spot near the back wall. I've been meaning to deal with it." "And the stove?" "Works. Drafts a little." "I can fix a draft." He looked at her sideways. "You can fix a stove draft." "My husband's family had a place with 3 stoves that all had opinions," she said, then went quiet, like the sentence had escaped before she'd cleared it for release. He didn't ask about the husband. They pulled through the gate. She held it open and latched it after the wagon passed, without being asked, and he drew up in front of the barn. The back door of the house opened, and Noah came out. He was a small boy, thin in the way of children who've stopped eating reliably, with dark hair that needed cutting and large dark eyes that he'd inherited from his mother, Silas's sister. He stood on the back steps and looked at the wagon and then at Clara with the expressionless attention of a child who has learned to assess situations carefully before committing to a reaction. Clara looked at him. "Hello," she said simply. No performance in it, no special soft voice people sometimes used with children who'd been hurt. No effort to make herself seem less than she was so he wouldn't be scared. Just hello, like she was speaking to someone her own size. Noah stared at her for a long moment. Then he went back inside. Silas climbed down from the wagon. "Don't take that personally." "I don't," Clara said. She was watching the door he'd gone through. He came outside to look. That's something. She slept that first night on a cot in the small room off the kitchen, clean but bare, with a window that looked out over the backyard toward the outbuildings. She'd made the bed herself with the linen Silas had produced from a chest in the hall, and she'd arranged her few things with the careful economy of someone used to small spaces. In the morning, she was up before anyone. Silas came down at 5:30 to find the stove already lit, coffee on, and Clara on her knees at the back wall of the kitchen with a lamp held close to the floorboards. "The soft spot goes about 2 feet in from the wall," she said without looking up. "The boards are rotted through, but the joist underneath looks like it might still have some integrity. It'll need to be shored up before it fails completely." He poured coffee, set a cup on the table where she could reach it. "You're awake early." "I looked around last night." She sat back on her heels. "The chimney in the main room has a crack in the mortar on the second flue. It's not dangerous yet, but it will be before spring. The window sash on the upstairs east bedroom is warped. It's not sealing, which means that room is losing heat. The gate hinge in front can be reseated with the right tools." Silas looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You diagnosed the house in one night." "I went around with a lamp after you went to bed." She picked up her coffee. "I like to know what I'm dealing with." He should have said something about how she didn't have to do all that, or how the structural problems were his concern, not hers. He didn't, because he respected competence, and because she was right about all of it, and he'd been the one who'd been letting it slide. "The tool shed's around the back of the barn," he said. "Got what you need for the hinge, probably." "I'll start there," she said. Noah came down at 6:30 and stopped in the kitchen doorway when he found Clara at the stove instead of Silas, stirring something that smelled like oatmeal with brown sugar. He stopped dead, the way he did when something surprised him, and Clara didn't turn around. "There's oatmeal," she said, "and coffee for the people who drink coffee. I don't know which category you fall in, but if it's oatmeal, it's on the stove." A pause. Noah went to the stove and picked up the ladle and stirred the oatmeal himself, inspecting it. "It's not burned," Clara said. "I was watching it." He put the ladle back and got a bowl from the shelf. He clearly knew where everything was, and served himself. He sat at the table and ate, and Clara moved around the kitchen doing other things, and they occupied the same space with a minimum of fuss. Silas watched this from the doorway and felt something that took him a minute to identify. He finally recognized it as relief, which surprised him. The days that followed fell into a shape, the way days do when people are practical and there's work to be done. Silas ran the cattle operation. He had a small herd, Herefords mostly, and enough land to graze them if he managed it right. Hector, his ranch hand, came Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays, a short and capable man of about 40 who spoke little English but could fix anything with moving parts, and seemed to view the world with an equanimity that Silas sometimes envied. Hector looked at Clara on her first day, looked at the latched gate that had been lopsided since June, and gave Silas a single raised eyebrow. Silas said nothing. Hector went back to work. Clara fixed the gate hinge that first morning, using a hinge plate from the tool shed and a chisel and a hammer, and she got it square on the third try, which was better than Silas had done when he'd attempted it in August and given up. She fixed the drafting problem on the stove by packing the flue joint with fire clay she found in the barn. She ordered the flue mortar repair from the hardware store in town, writing out the list herself and giving it to Silas to pick up on his next supply run. And when the materials arrived, she managed the repair herself, working from a ladder with a patience that he would have said was unlike most people he knew, except that he barely knew her yet. The floors she didn't fix yet. She said they needed dry lumber and the right kind of saw, and she wanted to wait until Hector was around to help with the joist. She had opinions about the order of operations, and she wasn't shy about them, but she also didn't barrel past anyone. She'd tell Silas what she thought and why, and then she'd do what they decided together. He wasn't used to that. He wasn't sure whether he liked it or just found it less exhausting than the alternatives. What she was doing to the house in other respects was harder to articulate. She washed the curtains. He hadn't known the curtains were that color underneath the dust. And scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees, and cleared out a room at the back of the barn that had been accumulating gear and equipment and broken things for years, sorting it into things that were worth keeping and things that were not. The house had begun to smell like something other than dust and old wood, and the faint, persistent cold of a place where the windows were never opened. It smelled like meals and soap, and sometimes like the pine tar she used on the fence posts when she helped Hector do the south fence line without anyone asking her to. It smelled, Silas thought one evening, like a house where someone actually lived. Noah watched her. He was a watcher, the boy. He'd take up a position and track what she was doing with those large dark eyes without coming close enough to be roped into conversation. She was aware of it. She didn't try to draw him out directly. She just did whatever she was doing and narrated it, loosely, The way you'd talk to yourself if you were the kind of person who talked to yourself. The trick to getting grease out of wool is cold water first, because heat sets it in. I think that crow has figured out we keep grain in the left outbuilding. Smart bird. Annoying bird. This door needs 3 inches taken off the bottom, or it's going to swell shut when the cold really comes in. Noah didn't respond to any of this, but he stopped holding himself so far away. On the 5th evening, Silas came in from the barn at past 8 to find the lamp still lit in the main room and Clara reading aloud from a book. She'd found it on the shelf, Cooper's The Pathfinder, a copy so old the spine was cracked, and Noah sitting on the floor about 4 feet away, not looking at her, ostensibly occupied with a piece of rope he was knotting and unknotting, but very clearly listening. She read without inflection, not like a performance, just like she was telling someone what happened next, and she didn't stop when Silas came in. He took off his boots at the door and sat in the chair by the window, and she kept reading, and the 3 of them sat in the lamplight with the Montana dark pressing against the windows, and the only sounds were her voice and the fire and the wind outside. And it was the most peaceful Silas had felt since his wife had been alive. He didn't examine that too closely. He just let it sit. Oh, she told him about herself in pieces. The way a person talks when they're not trying to tell you things, but they've run out of ways to avoid it. The boarding house in Billings, she'd run it for a man named Corvin, managing the accounts and the rooms and the meals, and she'd done it well enough that he'd started giving her less authority and more work in inverse proportion, because that was what certain men did when a woman was better at something than they'd expected. She'd left when the arrangement stopped being tenable. She said stopped being tenable in a precise, even way that he understood meant something specific had happened, and she wasn't going to say what. The farm in Kansas. She let that slip out slowly. She'd grown up on it. Her father's place. Hard years, drought years. A father who worked hard and drank harder and seemed to think those 2 things canceled each other out. She'd left at 19. The husband she'd mentioned once and not again. Silas understood that this was a territory he wasn't invited into yet. He didn't go there. What he understood from the accumulation of what she told him, and didn't tell him, was that Clara Whitmore had spent most of her adult life in situations that were someone else's. Someone else's house, someone else's terms, someone else's decisions about her worth. And she'd been competent and capable in all of them, and it had not, in any of them, been enough to keep her safe. He thought about that on a Tuesday afternoon while he was mending fence, and Hector was working the other line and the cattle were in the south pasture, unhurried and content. He thought about it, and he felt something uncomfortable that he eventually identified as recognition. He'd been in situations that weren't his own terms, too. Not the same situations, but the shape of the thing, feeling like you were building something and then watching it get taken, was familiar. His wife Margaret had been dead for 17 months. The ranch had belonged to both of them, really, even though only his name was on the deed. She'd built it with him, made the decisions with him, kept the books, and managed the supply ordering, and been the one who'd handled the relationships in town that kept things running smooth. When she died, of fever, in December 18 months ago, he'd lost a partner as much as a wife, and the 2 losses had tangled together in a way that made them hard to separate. He'd been managing since then, but managing was not the same as running things. Managing was just keeping the walls up. The books had gotten away from him. The house had gotten away from him. Noah had arrived in March already silent and grieving, and Silas had not known how to reach him because he'd been barely keeping his own head above water. He didn't think Clara was going to fix any of that. He wasn't looking for someone to fix things. But he did think, riding back to the barn that afternoon, with the light going orange over the mountains, that Red Bluff had made a mistake when they let her sit down in the mud. Their loss, he thought, and left it there. But the trouble with the town started in the 3rd week. It wasn't dramatic at first. Martha Holt, who was, Silas understood, the social center of gravity in Red Bluff, the person through whom all opinion circulated, had made her assessment of the situation and was letting it circulate. A woman living out at the Mercer place, the way she said it managing to imply several things at once that were nobody's business. Questions about who Clara was and where she'd come from and what her situation really was. Silas heard about it from Tom Aldrich, who came over to borrow a chain hoist and mentioned it the way neighbors mention things they thought you should know. He had the decency to look uncomfortable while he said it. "Martha's not saying anything directly," Tom said. "You know how she goes at things." I know how she goes at things, Silas said. I'm not saying she's right. Agnes thinks she's being a fool about it. Agnes was Tom's wife, a sensible woman with a direct manner who'd brought Clara a jar of preserves within the first week and stayed for coffee and a straightforward conversation that Silas had not been party to, but which Clara had reported with what seemed like genuine warmth. Martha can think what she wants, Silas said. It's a business arrangement. It's in writing. Tom nodded. But they both understood that what was in writing and what got talked about were different matters. Clara heard about it too. He was fairly sure Hector had told her, or maybe Agnes, or maybe she just read the temperature of the air when she went into town for supplies, and people's eyes went where they went. She didn't say anything about it to Silas directly. She just came back from town one afternoon and set the supplies down and said, I need to show you something in the books. The books were bad. He'd known they were bad. He hadn't known they were that bad. She'd been going through them for 3 evenings running, working at the kitchen table after Noah went to bed, and she'd laid it out for him now. The cattle operation was not breaking even. The loan on the property, taken out 4 years back to buy the south pasture, had a payment structure that got worse in the 3rd year. They were in the 3rd year. The margin between what they were making and what they owed was narrower than Silas had been allowing himself to understand. There's been an adjustment to the interest calculation, Clara said, pointing to a column. Here, do you see? It says the rate was renegotiated in June, but I don't see any paperwork for a renegotiation. Did someone speak to you about this? Silas looked at where she was pointing. Beaumont came by in June. The banker. He said there was a routine adjustment. Did he show you documentation? He said it was standard. He said I'd get paperwork. Did you? A pause. I don't think I did. Clara looked at him for a moment, and he could see her choosing not to say what she was thinking, which was probably something about the fact that you didn't let changes to a loan's interest rate go undocumented, and he already knew that, and it was not a thing that needed to be said out loud. I'd like to write to the lending institution directly, she said. Not through Beaumont, the institution itself. Verify what the actual terms are. Beaumont handles the account. He may handle it, but the institution owns it. She folded her hands on top of the ledger. There's something wrong here. Maybe it's an error. Maybe it's deliberate. But the number they're collecting doesn't match the number in the original agreement, and I'd like to know why. He'd looked at her in the lamplight, the ledger between them and the kitchen quiet, and the night outside the window, and he'd thought, she found this in 3 evenings, and I've been living with it for months. Write to them, he said. She wrote the letter the next morning. 3 days before the end of the month, Noah spoke for the first time. It was evening, and Clara was reading again. She'd moved through half of the Pathfinder and started Ivanhoe, which was denser going, but she managed it without slowing. And Noah was in his usual position, floor, rope, not looking at her. Silas was at the table with the account books, doing the arithmetic that he now understood was more precarious than he'd let himself see. Clara read a passage in which a character was described as having no idea which direction was home. Noah said quietly, into the middle of the room, he should look at the stars. Silence. Clara lowered the book. She didn't make a thing of it. She didn't look at Noah with an expression that was too big. She said, which stars? Noah was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding whether this was safe. The North Star, he said. It doesn't move, Pa showed me. Your pa was right, Clara said. You can always find north if you can find the North Star. That's useful. Another silence. Does the man find his way home? Noah said. I don't know yet, Clara said. I haven't read that far. We'll find out together. She went back to reading. Silas kept his eyes on the account book and did not trust himself to look up for a while. Later that night, after Noah was in bed and Clara was washing the dinner dishes, and Silas was on the porch with his coffee going cold in his hands, she came out and stood next to him, and they looked at the dark together for a while. I don't know what made him talk, she said. I think you did, Silas said. I didn't do anything particular. I know, he said. That was the thing. She was quiet. The mountains were shapes against the lesser darkness of the sky, and the stars were out in force, the way they got in October out here, crowding the sky like they were trying to get a look at something. The letter to the bank, she said. I want to send it tomorrow. I know. We'll send it. There's something wrong with that loan, Silas. I can't prove it yet, but the numbers don't add up any way I turn them. He believed her. He'd believed her since the first evening she'd shown him the discrepancy, and the belief had been sitting in his chest like a cold stone. A man named Beaumont, who'd come by in June with smooth explanations and a handshake and no paperwork. A loan that had somehow gotten more expensive without anyone asking him. He'd been too deep in his grief and is managing to keep going to see it clearly. He saw it now. We send the letter, he said, and then we find out what we're dealing with. She nodded. They stood a while longer in the cold, not talking, until the coffee was completely cold and the night was full and it was time to go inside. Neither of them knew what was coming. But something about standing there, with the stars out and the ranch quiet around them, made it feel like whatever it was something they were going to face with their eyes open. That was more than either of them had had in a long time. The letter came back in 11 days. Clara had been counting, not obsessively. She had enough to occupy her hands and her mind without standing at the window watching the road. But she'd been aware of the count the way you're aware of a bruise you keep pressing to see if it still hurts. 11 days from posting to reply was fast for correspondence with the lending institution in Helena, which meant whoever had received it had considered it worth responding to quickly. She read it at the kitchen table while Silas stood by the stove and Noah sat on the floor nearby pretending to read a school book, which he wasn't. He was listening. He did that. The letter was from a man named Aldous Crane, listed as Assistant Director of Accounts at the First Territorial Bank of Helena. It was written in the careful, slightly over-formal language of a man who was being precise because precision gave him protection. It confirmed the original loan terms. It confirmed the original interest rate. It made no mention of any renegotiation in June, and when Clara read of the paragraph that said we have no record of correspondence with or visit from any representative of this institution to your property in the month of June of this year, she set the letter down flat on the table and pressed her palm on top of it. What does it say? Silas said. It says the bank didn't renegotiate your loan. He was quiet for a moment. Beaumont came out in June. Beaumont came out. But he's not a representative of the lending institution. He's the local agent. She looked up. He changed your interest rate without authorization and has been collecting the difference. The word for what that was sat in the air between them, unspoken, because it was a serious word and serious words needed a moment before you committed to them. How much? Silas said finally. Over 14 months? She'd already done the arithmetic 3 times because she'd wanted to be sure. Between $40 and $50, maybe more. Depending on whether this is the only account he's managing this way. Silas set down his coffee cup. He did it carefully, which was how she'd come to recognize that he was very angry. He was a man who went quiet and controlled when he was furious, not loud. I want to go see Beaumont, he said. Not yet, Clara said. He looked at her. If you go see him right now, he'll know we know, and he'll have time to adjust things before we have the full picture. We need the full picture first. She tapped the letter. This tells us the original terms. I need to pull the payment records for every month going back to when this adjustment started. I need to know exactly what was taken and when. And I want to know if there are other ranches with the same bank. She paused. Agnes Aldrich mentioned her husband has a loan. Tom mentioned it. Tom's loan is with the same bank. I know. I'd like to see his ledger too if he'll let us. Not now. We need to be careful about who we tell and when. But if Beaumont is running this scheme across multiple accounts, the picture is bigger than just your loan. She watched Silas work through it. He was not a fast thinker exactly. It wasn't that he was slow, more that he didn't commit to a conclusion until he'd turned it over a few times and looked at the underside. She'd come to appreciate that about him. Impulsive men made things worse in her experience. You think this is bigger? He said. I think a man who's willing to falsify one loan adjustment is unlikely to have done it only once. She picked up the letter again. I think we need to be very careful. From the floor, without looking up from his schoolbook, Noah said, Is someone stealing from us? Silas and Clara looked at each other. We're trying to find out, Clara said, but we're going to handle it. Noah considered this. Then he went back to the schoolbook, which he was now actually reading, or at least appearing to. Clara noticed his jaw had tightened, though. He was 8 years old, and he'd already learned that the world could take things from you without warning. She didn't make light of it. The next 3 weeks were the strangest kind of busy. The surface of things looked the same, work and meals and evenings by the fire, but underneath all of it, something taut and watchful had taken up residence. Clara sent 2 more letters, one to the bank in Helena asking for a full accounting of all payments received and their dates, and one to a land title office requesting a copy of the original deed and loan documentation. She did this quietly, mailing them herself when she rode into town for supplies, and she didn't discuss it with anyone outside the ranch. Tom Aldrich came over on a Thursday, ostensibly to help with the floor repair that had been waiting. He and Hector and Silas worked the joists while Clara managed the supply of materials and ran the saw when they needed shorter lengths. And at midday, they ate lunch at the big table, and Tom said, over his coffee, "Agnes heard in town that you've been asking questions about the bank." "I've been corresponding with the bank, yes," Clara said. Tom looked at Silas. Silas looked at his coffee. "Is there something wrong?" Tom said. "We're not sure yet," Claire said. "Tom, does your loan payment seem right to you? Has it stayed the same as when you originally agreed to it?" Tom was a careful man, the kind who built fences methodically and didn't cut corners, but he was not a man who spent his evenings with a ledger. He frowned. "I pay what they bill me. I figured it was interest adjustments." "Did anyone come to tell you about an adjustment?" "Beaumont came by in, I think it was sometime in the summer." She and Silas exchanged a glance so small it would have been invisible to anyone not paying attention. "Can I look at your payment records?" Claire asked. "I'm not asking you to get involved in anything. I just want to look." Tom said yes, with the slightly reluctant cooperation of a man who doesn't like finding out he might have a problem, and she went through his ledger that afternoon and found the same pattern. Same month. Different amount, because Tom's original loan was different, but the same unexplained rate increase, the same absence of documentation, the same Beaumont. She wrote down the numbers in her own notebook and gave Tom back his ledger. "What do I do?" he said. "Right now?" "Nothing. Pay what you've been paying and don't let Beaumont know we've noticed anything." She looked at him evenly. "If I'm right, there's more than 2 of you." "How many more?" "I don't know yet. But if he's been working this valley for any time at all—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Tom drove home that evening looking like a man who'd walked into a room expecting one thing and found something else entirely. 6. The other piece of the problem arrived from an unexpected direction. His name was Rutherford Crane. No relation to the bank's Aldous Crane, just an unfortunate coincidence of names. And he arrived in Red Bluff in the first week of November with 2 men who worked for him and a surveyor's kit in a manner that occupied space the way certain men did, as though the air around them was already adjusted to their requirements. He was a cattle baron, not locally. He ran a large operation in the eastern part of the territory, but he'd been buying land in the Bluff Valley for 2 years, quietly, accumulating parcels the way certain men accumulated things, not because they needed them, but because having them prevented other people from having them. His name had come up in conversation. Clara had heard it from Agnes. In the context of, "There's talk that Crane's been looking at the Morrow place, and somebody said Crane bought the Henderson parcel last spring." She hadn't thought much about it until she found Crane himself standing outside the land office talking to Beaumont on a Tuesday afternoon when she was in town for supplies. She wouldn't have recognized Crane except that Agnes had described him. Big man, gray at the temples, always wears a brown hat with a flat brim. And she recognized the hat. She slowed slightly, not enough to be noticed, and did what she was good at. She occupied space quietly, and she paid attention. They weren't trying to be particularly discreet. Why would they be? 2 men talking outside an office was not unusual, but Beaumont's hands moved the way a man's hands moved when he was making numbers with them in the air, and Crane had an expression of patient, satisfied attention, the way a man listened when someone was reporting progress. She kept walking. She bought her supplies. She drove back to the ranch. That evening, she told Silas. "Crane's been buying land in this valley," she said. "Beaumont manages the bank loans for most of the properties in this area. If Beaumont manipulates the loan terms to make the payments more than people can sustain, the ranchers fall behind," Silas said, "and foreclosure lets the bank reclaim the property. And whoever has a relationship with the bank, Gets first option on the land. He said it slowly, like he was stacking the pieces as he said them, at a price that's probably below what it's worth. It's a scheme, Clara said. It's a systematic scheme, and we stumbled into the middle of it. She watched the muscle in his jaw work. How many ranches? He said. In this valley? If it's been running for 2 years. She thought about the properties Agnes had mentioned, the Henderson parcel, the Morrow place, 2 others she'd heard in passing. At least 4, possibly 6 or 7. People lost their land, Silas said. It wasn't a question, and probably had no idea why the payments had gotten so far ahead of them that they couldn't catch up. She'd seen it before, not this exact scheme, but the shape of it. The way financial manipulation was invisible until it wasn't, because most people trusted that the numbers they were given were the real numbers. Silas sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was something he did when he was thinking through something he didn't like. What do we do? He said. We need documentation, complete documentation, for your loan and Tom's at minimum, with the original terms and the unauthorized changes clearly laid out. We need correspondence from the bank and Helena confirming what the real terms should be, and we need to find someone with legal authority to take it to. She paused. There's a federal land agent in Missoula. If the scheme crosses multiple properties and involves fraud, it stops being a local matter. That's going to take time. Yes. And in the meantime, we're still paying the inflated rate. Yes. Which is why the other thing I need to talk to you about is the money. The money was the second problem, and it was immediate. The loan situation had revealed something that was already true before Beaumont's manipulation. The ranch was not making enough. Not dramatically, catastrophically, not enough. It was a manageable ranch with a workable herd, and Silas was a competent rancher. But the margin was thin enough that the inflated loan payments had pushed them to the edge of what the monthly income could cover. We're running at about $12 short every month, Clara said. She'd been through the books 3 times now, and this was the honest number. With winter coming, that shortfall is going to get wider before it gets narrower. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I can sell 2 head. That's a temporary fix, and selling down a herd in winter isn't optimal. I know it's not optimal. I'm not criticizing. I know you're not. He rubbed his face. He looked tired. He was working the ranch, dealing with Noah, sitting with this situation every evening, and she could see the accumulation of it on him. What else? She'd been thinking about this for a week. Not just thinking, exactly. She'd been watching and listening and mapping what she knew against what was possible. The ranch has assets that aren't being used, she said. Not cattle assets, people assets. He looked at her. I can take in laundry, she said. I've already spoken to May about it. She said the diner's been wanting someone to handle their linens reliably, and they'll pay a fixed amount per week. I can do that here. I can also do mending and alterations. There's no seamstress closer than 30 miles, and I've seen what people are making do with. She paused. If we opened the small equipment shed as a proper workshop, I could do repairs, small machinery, harness work, that sort of thing. I'm not a blacksmith, but there's a lot of repair work that doesn't require a blacksmith. That's you, Silas said. What are the people assets? Hector. She'd spoken to Hector carefully, testing the idea, and he'd looked at her the way he looked at most of her ideas, with a flat, evaluating expression that gradually shifted toward this might not be stupid. He knows every piece of equipment in the county and half of what's wrong with it. If you were willing to lend him out 2 days a week to neighbors who need repair help, he could bring in wages. Hector's my hand. He'd still be your hand for 3 days a week, same as now. 2 days he'd be earning outside wages that we'd split with him fairly. She held up a hand before he could object. I know it's not ideal, but it's honest work and it keeps us above water while we deal with the other thing. Silas was quiet for a long moment. What about you? He said. You're already doing more than what we agreed. I agreed to household management, she said. The laundry and mending are household management, just extended slightly. She paused. I'm not doing it out of charity. If we go under, I'm out of a position. My interests and yours are the same right now. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd started to recognize. He got it when she said something that was true in a way that was also, underneath the truth, not only practical. He didn't comment on it. He rarely did. All right, he said. We try it. Mum. November came in cold and they worked. The laundry alone was brutal work. She was doing linens for the diner 3 times a week and taking in private work on top of that, hauling water and boiling and wringing and hanging, her hands going raw and red in the cold. She bought herself a pair of oilskin gloves from the mercantile, the men's size because they had more material, and wore them until she didn't need them, which was rarely. Silas noticed without being told and rigged a drying line in the barn that was protected from the wind, which meant the linens didn't freeze solid before they dried, which was a practical help she thanked him for without making it into anything more than it was. Hector turned out to be the best decision she'd made since arriving, because word of his availability spread through the ranching community without anyone particularly promoting it, the way practical information spread in isolated communities where everyone needed everyone else and pretended otherwise. He came back from his first outside job with $4 and a bucket of potatoes from Tom Aldrich's root cellar, and he handed the potatoes to Clara without explanation and put the money on the kitchen table and seemed to regard the entire enterprise as obvious, which she respected. She took in mending. She didn't advertise it exactly. She mentioned it to May, who mentioned it to 3 other people, which was all the advertising that needed doing. Work came in by wagon and by rider, and once by a boy of about 12, who showed up at the gate with a bundle wrapped in newspaper and instructions from his mother, and Clara took it, paid the boy a penny for the errand, and added it to the pile. She worked evenings after Noah went to bed, at the kitchen table with the lamp, and sometimes Silas was at the other end of the table with the account books, and they worked in the same silence they'd developed since the beginning, easy and unfraught. Sometimes he'd say something about a number he was looking at, and she'd say something back, and they'd work through it together. And sometimes they just sat and did their separate work, and the fire burned down, and neither of them noticed until it was cold. She thought one evening that she'd been in houses before that had people in them and still felt empty, and this house was the opposite. Not because it was full, there were 3 of them, and the ranch hand, and the occasional visitor, but because of the quality of the attention the people in it paid to each other. She couldn't have explained that to anyone, so she didn't try. She just noted it and kept hemming a pair of work trousers that needed 3 inches taken off the legs. Noah was talking more, not constantly. He was still a quiet child by disposition, she thought, independent of the grief. But the evening readings had cracked something open, and he'd started asking questions, initially at her and then, gradually, at Silas too. Silas answered them the same way he did most things, directly, without decoration, treating Noah's questions as worth answering rather than cute things a child had said. She watched Noah clock that. He noticed that his questions were being taken seriously, and it made him braver about asking them. One evening, he asked Clara while she was washing dishes and he was drying. He'd started doing this without being asked, taking up the dish towel and stationing himself next to her with the matter-of-fact helpfulness of a child who understood that work was shared. "Why didn't anyone help you in town? When you fell down?" She thought about how to answer this. She didn't want to make it simple, because it wasn't. "People are afraid of things they don't understand," she said. "I was a stranger with no money and no connection to anyone they knew. To them, helping me might have meant taking on a problem they didn't know the size of. But you weren't a problem. I know that, but they didn't, yet." She handed him a pot to dry. "Not everyone thinks that way. Some people just weren't raised to help strangers, and some were having their own hard days and didn't have anything left over." Noah dried the pot, thinking. "Uncle Silas helped you." "He did." "Why?" She considered this honestly. "I think," she said, "because it bothered him more to watch someone sit in the mud and do nothing than it bothered him to take a risk on a stranger." Noah thought about this for a while. Then he said, "I think that's the right way to be." "I think so too," Clara said. The income strategy was working, in the way that things work when they're being held together with effort and practicality rather than ease. By the end of November, they were covering the month's shortfall and had pulled together a small reserve. Not enough to be comfortable, but enough to stop the bleeding. The letter exchange with the bank in Helena was proceeding slowly, as bureaucratic correspondence did, but Clara had received a second confirmation of the original loan terms and a third letter that included, crucially, a statement that any modification to loan terms requires written authorization from both the borrowing party and a licensed representative of this institution and must be filed with our office before taking effect. Beaumont had neither. She was certain of it now. She was also beginning to be certain that Crane was not a coincidence. She put the pieces of it in a letter to a lawyer in Missoula named Garrett Bell, whose name Agnes had given her. Agnes had gone to school with his younger sister, which was how his name was known in the valley. She described the situation in plain, specific language, attaching copies of the relevant correspondence and the arithmetic she'd done comparing the original loan terms to the payments collected. She asked him if this constituted fraud, and whether the matter fell under federal jurisdiction, given that the scheme appeared to cross property lines and involve multiple parties. She sent the letter on a Tuesday. She told Silas what she'd done on a Wednesday. He looked at her for a moment. "When did you draft it?" "Last week. I wanted to make sure I had the full documentation before I sent it." "And you didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." "Clara." He said her name in a particular flat way that meant he was choosing his words. "We're in this together. I need to know what you're doing." "You're right," she said, because he was. "I should have told you before I sent it. I move fast when I see the shape of something. I'll be more careful." He seemed to weigh whether this was a satisfactory answer. It wasn't entirely, she could see that. He was a man who didn't like being managed, even well-meaningly, and she understood that. "What's the lawyer going to say?" he said. "I don't know yet. Probably that it takes time. These things always take time." She paused. "But we need someone in our corner who understands the legal side of it, because Beaumont and Crane will have lawyers who do." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Next time, you tell me first." "Yes," she said. They left it there. The letter from Garrett Bell arrived in early December, and it was both better and worse than she'd expected. Better. He believed, based on the documentation she'd provided, that there was a case for fraud. The manipulation of loan terms without authorization from the lending institution was illegal. If it could be demonstrated that this was coordinated with a third party to effect forced foreclosures and the subsequent transfer of property at below market value, it could constitute conspiracy. Worse, it would take time. He'd need to correspond with the bank directly, request records that the bank might or might not provide voluntarily, and potentially involve federal authorities. These were not things that happened in weeks. In the meantime, Bell wrote, "I would strongly advise that you and any other affected parties continue to make loan payments as billed, even the fraudulent amounts, to avoid providing grounds for default proceedings. Keep meticulous records of everything. Do not confront the local agent. If you can, document any additional contact from either Beaumont or Crane. Continue to make the fraudulent payments," Silas said. "While we build the case," Clara said, "I know it's galling." "It's more than galling. I know." She folded the letter. "But if we stop paying and they initiate foreclosure proceedings, we're fighting on two fronts at once, and we're weaker." Bell's right. We keep paying, we keep records, and we build the case. Silas was quiet, standing at the window, looking out at the range where his cattle moved in the thin December light. She watched his back, and she understood that this was not a simple thing for him. It was his land, his family's effort laid into it, his wife's labor folded into the very ground. And to keep paying a man who was stealing from him was a particular kind of humiliation that had nothing to do with practicality. "Silas," she said quietly. He didn't turn around immediately. "We're not going to lose it," she said. She wasn't certain of that. She was reasonably certain of it, which was the best she could offer. "We have the documentation, we have a lawyer, we have the bank's own written confirmation of the original terms. Beaumont's scheme works on people who don't know they're being robbed. We know." He turned around. His face was the controlled face he wore when he was carrying something heavy. "You're sure about Bell?" he said. "Agnes trusts him. The letter's competent. He's precise, he's careful, and he's not trying to take our money with empty promises. He said what he could do and what he couldn't and what it would take." She paused. "I'm not certain of anything, but I think he's the right person." Silas looked at her for a long moment, and she held the look because there wasn't anything to hide, and she'd found that looking away often invited misinterpretation. "All right," he said. "We do it Bell's way." Simone. Christmas came and went with the particular spare quality of winter on the frontier. There wasn't much for it. She made a pudding from dried fruit and cornmeal that was better than it had any right to be, and Silas produced a book for Noah that he'd special ordered from the town's dry goods store. a natural history with illustrations, and Noah received it with the solemn attention he gave things he actually cared about, and spent the rest of the day reading it in front of the fire with his knees drawn up and didn't speak much, which was fine, because the quality of his silence had changed from the closed-off silence of the first weeks to the absorbed silence of a child who was safe enough to disappear into something. Claire had nothing to give either of them. She'd known this was coming and had made her peace with it, mostly. She made a new pair of work gloves for Silas. She'd been sewing them in secret for 3 weeks, using hide Hector had cured and set aside, and they fit because she'd measured his hands against a pair that were wearing out. She gave them to him on Christmas morning without ceremony, just set them on the table next to his coffee. He picked them up, looked at them for a moment with an expression she couldn't read exactly. "You made these," he said. "You needed new ones. The left one on your current pair has a split in the palm." "I know." He turned them over. They were well made. She was a good seamstress and she'd been careful. "Thank you, Clara." She went back to the stove. Agnes came by in the afternoon with a jar of honey and her youngest daughter, and they sat around the kitchen table and drank tea, and Agnes told them in a careful, quiet voice when the children were occupied elsewhere that she'd spoken to 2 other ranch wives in the valley, and both had the same story. Beaumont had been by. There'd been an adjustment, no paperwork. "They're frightened," Agnes said. Ellen Morrow specifically. She said her husband nearly lost his mind over it last spring because they couldn't understand why they were falling behind. "Where is the Morrow place now?" Clara asked. "They sold it. They didn't foreclose. They sold because they couldn't keep up, and they thought they were failing somehow." Agnes's voice was even, but tight at the edges. "They're in town now. Roy works at the mill." Clara sat with that for a moment. The Morrows had sold their ranch at whatever price they could get, because they'd been quietly robbed of the ability to keep it, and they'd never known it, and they were living in town now, working a mill job, and probably thought they'd failed somehow. "When we're ready," Clara said, "I'd like to talk to Roy Morrow." Agnes nodded. She understood what Clara meant, when they had something to offer him besides a story, when there was a legal path that might get him something back. They left that conversation there and talked about other things for a while, because some things had to be set down and picked up later, and the afternoon light was going golden, and Agnes's daughter was laughing at something Noah said in the other room, and the kitchen smelled like tea and the honey they'd put in it, and outside the window the snow was coming down soft and steady over the pasture and the mountains beyond. Clara watched the snow and thought about the spring. There was going to be a fight. She'd known that since the moment she'd understood what Beaumont was doing, and she'd known it more clearly since Agnes named the pattern and Belle confirmed it had legal weight. Beaumont and Crane were not going to let this unravel without resistance. Men with that much to protect never did. But she looked around the kitchen, at the clean floor and the lamp burning properly, and the stove drafting right, and the shelf where Noah's new book sat. And she thought about a woman who'd sat down in the mud in a Red Bluff street with 11 cents and no plan, and she thought, we are considerably further along than we were. That wasn't nothing. That was, in fact, the whole point. She picked up her tea. The snow kept falling. The first warning came from the horses. Clara had learned in her months at the ranch to read the animals the way you read weather, not by looking directly at the sky, but by watching how things responded to it. The horses in the near paddock had a particular restlessness they got before storms, a circling and head-tossing that was different from ordinary impatience. On a Thursday night in late January, she woke at 2:30 to that sound and lay still for a moment, listening. No wind, no storm coming. She got up. She didn't light the lamp. She went to the window of her room off the kitchen and looked out at the yard, and the yard was dark and still, the snow on the ground reflecting enough of the starlight that she could see shapes. The horses were moving along the fence line. The barn door, she'd latched it herself at 9 o'clock, was closed. Nothing was there. She stood at the window for another minute, then went back to bed and lay awake until 5, which was when she gave up and started the stove. She mentioned it to Silas at breakfast. "Coyote, maybe," he said. "Maybe." She poured his coffee. "Or someone on foot who knew enough not to come into the yard." He looked at her. "You think someone was out there?" "I think the horses thought so." She sat down. "I'm probably wrong." He didn't say she was probably right, and he didn't say she was probably wrong. He drank his coffee and looked out the window and said, "I'll check the fence line today." He found boot prints in the snow along the south fence, 200 yards out. 2 sets, going and coming back. Not ranch work boots, town boots, the narrow-soled kind. He told her that evening. She didn't say I told you. She started locking her bedroom window, which she'd been leaving cracked for air. Garrett Bell's letter arrived in the second week of February, and it was the most substantive communication they'd had from him yet. He had made direct contact with the First Territorial Bank of Helena. He had obtained, through a formal records request, payment logs for 6 properties in Bluff Valley, including Silas's and Tom Aldrich's. And the discrepancy between the authorized loan terms and the amounts collected was documented across all 6. He had also, through a colleague with connections to the territorial government, identified that 2 of those properties had been subsequently acquired by a landholding company registered in the name of a man named Wesley Crane, Rutherford Crane's older brother. "It's a family operation," Clara said. They were at the kitchen table, Bell's letter between them, and Noah was in bed. Hector had gone home an hour ago. The ranch was quiet around them. Wesley Crane holds the land company. Rutherford manages the cattle operation. Beaumont provides the mechanism. He manipulates the loans. The ranchers can't sustain the payments. They either foreclose or sell under pressure. Silas said it steadily, working through it. And the land transfers to the company, at prices well below market value because the sellers are desperate. Clara had been through this logic a dozen times, but saying it aloud still produced a cold, specific anger. Bell says he's filing a formal complaint with the Territorial Attorney General's office. He's also been in contact with a federal land agent in Missoula who has jurisdiction over fraudulent land transactions. How long? She looked at the letter again. The process of formal investigation and legal proceedings may require several months, and outcomes cannot be guaranteed at this stage. Though the documentation is substantially stronger than many cases of this nature I have encountered. He says months. He says the documentation is strong. Months, Silas repeated. Yes. He was quiet. She understood what he was weighing. Months meant continuing to make the inflated payments. Months meant staying below Beaumont's radar. Months meant the ranch staying viable on the thread and wire income they'd been building. They'd done well enough. The reserve had grown to $60, which was not comfortable, but was better than the $12 monthly shortfall they'd been running in October. Still, months was a long time to hold something together on careful management and controlled hope. "There's something else," she said. He looked at her. "Bell says we should be prepared for the possibility that Crane becomes aware of the investigation. He says," she found the line, "parties engaged in schemes of this nature often have relationships with local officials and are not unaware of threats to their operations. Should you have reason to believe your safety or property is at risk, you should not hesitate to seek assistance from neighboring landowners or territorial authorities." Silas read that section himself, set the letter down. "The boot prints," he said. "That was 3 weeks ago." She paused. "I don't think it was coincidence." He was quiet for a long moment, and she let him be quiet, because some things needed room to settle before you could talk about them properly. "I'm not leaving," he said finally. "I know you're not. And I'm not sending Noah away to—" "Silas!" She said his name the way he sometimes said hers, not to stop him, but to make him hear her. "I'm not suggesting either of those things. I'm saying we need to be aware, and we need to tell Tom, and probably a few others. Agnes already knows the financial piece. She needs to know the rest." Clara folded Bell's letter along its creases. "Crane's not going to wait for a federal investigation to conclude before he decides whether to protect himself. And protecting himself means making sure we can't testify about what we know." She said it plainly because she thought Silas was someone who could hear a plain thing and was better served by it than by softening. He heard it. His face showed that he heard it. "All right," he said. "I'll ride to Tom's tomorrow morning." Tom Aldrich listened to all of it in his kitchen with Agnes sitting beside him and the fire going, and both of them wearing expressions that moved from grim to grimmer as Silas laid it out. When he was done, Tom sat with his hands flat on the table and said, "So they might come." "We don't know that," Silas said, "but Bell thinks we should be prepared." "Are you?" Silas looked at him. "I've got a rifle and a shotgun and Hector and Clara, who apparently doesn't scare." He said the last part with a quality in his voice that wasn't quite lightness, but was adjacent to it, the way certain honest men acknowledged something without making it soft. Tom said he had 2 rifles and a shotgun and a dog that was, in his estimation, more useful than most men. He also said he had 2 neighboring families he trusted, the Hennessy brothers to the east and old Stuart Greer, who'd been on his land for 30 years and didn't take to strangers on his fence lines under any circumstances. Get word to them, Silas said. Not the details, just watchfulness. I can do that, Tom said. Agnes had been listening to all of this with the particular focused quiet of a woman who is doing arithmetic. She looked at Clara, not Silas. How much time do we have? Agnes asked. Realistically, I don't know, Clara said. If Crane has someone watching the mail routes, and Bell's letter suggests he might have local connections, he may already know a formal complaint has been filed. She paused. That would put pressure on his timeline. Agnes nodded, the same short nod Clara had come to associate with, I understand, and I'm not going to fall apart about it. Then we don't wait for them to move first. No, Clara said. We don't. Riding back to the ranch in the cold February afternoon, Silas and Clara side by side on the wagon, neither of them talked for the first mile. The road was frozen hard and the horse's breath came out in clouds, and the mountains north were sharp against the white sky. I want to talk about Noah, Silas said. I know. If something happens, nothing's going to happen to Noah, she said. If anything starts, he goes into the root cellar and he does not come out until we say so. She'd already been through this in her mind. The root cellar was solid, stone-lined, with a heavy door that latched from the inside. She'd shown Noah how to work the latch, telling him it was in case of bad weather. He'd been 8 when his parents died in a fire because he'd been in the barn. He knew, somewhere in his body, how to stay safe in small enclosed spaces. She hated that he knew this, but it was true. He's going to ask questions, Silas said. He asks questions about everything. We answer them honestly. Silas was quiet for a moment. He asked me last week why we had more rifles out. Clara looked at him. What did you tell him? I told him we were having trouble with coyotes. He paused. He said he hadn't heard any coyotes. He's observant. Too observant. There was something in his voice that wasn't irritation. It was closer to helpless pride. The feeling of watching a child be exactly the kind of person you'd want them to be at a time when you'd rather they were simpler. Tell him the truth, Clara said. Not all of it, but enough. He's been through enough to know that pretending danger doesn't exist doesn't make it go away. He'll feel safer knowing what the real shape of it is. Silas thought about this. Then he said, When did you get so sure about children? I'm not sure about anything, she said. I just know what it felt like to be lied to about danger when I was small. It made the danger bigger, not smaller. He didn't press on that. She hadn't intended to say it and she wasn't going to explain it. But he heard it the way he heard most things she said about her past, carefully, without making an event of it. All right, he said. We tell him enough. They told Noah that evening. Silas did it, Clara sitting at the table nearby. And he told the boy that some men in the area had been doing something dishonest with the ranch's money, that they were working with a lawyer to fix it, and that until it was fixed, they needed to be careful about strangers on the property. Noah sat through this with his hands in his lap and his face doing the thing it did when he was processing something seriously. When Silas finished, Noah said, Like robbers. Like robbers, yes, but the kind who use paper and banks instead of guns. But they might use guns too. A pause. Silas looked at Clara. They might, Clara said. Which is why you know about the root cellar, and which is why you're going to come to me or your uncle immediately if you ever see anyone you don't recognize near the barn or the fence. Noah absorbed this. Then he said, I already did that. Silas went very still. What do you mean? A man. A few weeks ago. He was by the south fence in the morning. I didn't know if I should say something. He looked at Silas with a direct, somewhat agonized expression that said he'd been carrying this and uncertain about it. I thought I'd imagined it. You didn't imagine it, Clara said. You did the right thing by telling us now. Next time, you come to us right away, all right? Even if you're not sure. All right, Noah said. He looked at his hands. I don't want them to take the ranch. They won't, Silas said. He said it with a flatness that was not false confidence, but something more like a statement of intent. They won't because I won't let them. Clara heard the difference. Noah heard it too. The attack came on a Wednesday night in early March, 3 weeks after they'd spoken to Tom, 6 weeks after Belle's first letter to the Territorial Attorney General, and on a night that had been unremarkable in every way until it wasn't. Claire had gone to bed at 10. She woke at, she didn't know exactly, her internal clock said it was somewhere between midnight and 1, to the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke. The cook fire was banked. This was something different, sharp, and chemical. The smell of something burning that wasn't meant to. She was out of bed before she'd fully decided to be. She went to the window and the barn was on fire. Not engulfed. It was early yet. The fire running along the base of the south wall where something had been set against it, and in the orange light she could see 3 shapes at the edge of the yard, not running, just standing, which was worse than running in a particular way she understood immediately. They were watching to see if the fire drew people out. She did not go out. She went into the hall and hit Silas's door hard, twice. "Barn's on fire," she said through the door. "3 men in the yard, don't go out the front." She heard him moving. She went to Noah's room. He was awake, sitting up, eyes wide, and she said, quickly and clearly, "Root cellar, right now. Don't make noise. Don't use a lamp." "Is the house?" "Not yet." "Root cellar, Noah. Go." He went. She heard his feet on the back stairs and the soft sound of the cellar door, and then nothing. Good. She went back to the hall and met Silas coming out of his room with the rifle. "3 men," she said. "They said it and waited. They want us outside." "I know." He moved to the window at the end of the hall that looked over the yard. She went to her own room for the shotgun. Silas had gotten it for her 6 weeks ago, after the boot prints, and she'd practiced with it until she understood it properly. She came back to the hall. Through the window, the barn was burning in earnest now. The cattle were in the north pasture. Thank whatever luck existed that it was a mild enough night and she'd left them out. The horses were in the near paddock, and she could hear them, their panic high and specific. She wanted to go to them and couldn't. "They'll do the horses next," she said. "Or the house." "I know. If we stay inside, they either have to come in or wait for us. And if they fire the house, they might." She said it steadily. "We need someone to know." Silas looked at her. "There's no time to ride for Tom." "There's time to fire a shot," she said. "Tom knows the situation. He's half a mile north. Sound carries." He considered this for about 2 seconds. Then he went to the window and fired once into the air, a flat crack that split the night. She watched the 3 shapes in the yard. They moved, not toward the house, but sideways, spreading out, which told her they'd been given a plan. "They've done this before," she said. "Yes." She moved to the front window and looked out, and there was a 4th man she hadn't seen, closer to the house by the gate. He'd been in the shadow. He was looking up at the window she was looking out of. She stepped back. 4. One at the gate. "Can you take the back?" "Yes." She went downstairs in the dark, not slowly and not in a panic, because panic used energy that she needed elsewhere. She went to the kitchen, to the window over the sink that looked out over the backyard toward the outbuildings, and she stood to the side of it and looked out. The backyard was clear. The barn's south wall was fully burning now, the fire climbing and the orange light threw long shadows across the snow, and in those shadows she watched for movement. A shape came around the corner of the small equipment shed. She raised the shotgun. The man moved toward the back door of the house, and she said loudly enough to be heard through the window, "I see you and I'm armed. Stop where you are." He stopped. He was maybe 30 feet away, a dark shape against the burning light, and she couldn't see his face, but she could see that he had something in his hand and it wasn't a rifle. She looked at what he was holding. It was a bottle. The house. They were going to fire the house. She kicked the back door open. She'd thought hard about this in the quarter second she had, the calculus of whether to stay at the window or move, and she'd decided moving was the less predictable choice, and she stepped out onto the back step with the shotgun raised. "Put it down," she said. He hesitated. "I'm not going to say it again," she said. He put it down. Or he started to. He bent toward the ground as if he was going to set the bottle down, and then he came back up running, not toward her but sideways, toward the corner of the house. And she tracked him and did not fire because firing at a moving man in the dark with a shotgun was less reliable than the stories made it seem, and she was not going to miss and lose the advantage of him thinking she would shoot. From the front of the house she heard voices, more than one, and then a shot, and then Silas's voice, not words she could make out, and then from the north, from the direction of the Aldrich place, a different shot, distant and flat in the cold air. Tom had heard. The man who'd run sideways was at the corner of the house now, and she tracked him, and then from the side of the barn, the burning side, the south wall, she saw another shape come around, and this one was moving fast toward the paddock, and she understood what he was going to do. She fired, not at him. Over him, into the air above and ahead of him, close enough that the sound would be the point of it, and he pulled up short and stumbled and went to one knee in the snow, and she called out, "Next one I aim!" which was not a certain truth, but she said it like it was. He stayed on his knee. From the front, more voices. Running feet. Then cutting through everything, a sound she hadn't expected. A dog, barking in the particular driven way Tom's dog barked when it was on something. They were coming. What happened in the next 10 minutes was confusion, in the honest sense of the word. Not dramatic chaos, but the actual disorienting difficulty of multiple things happening in different places in the dark. She heard Tom's voice from somewhere north of the fence. She heard Silas shout something. The man by the equipment shed was on his feet and running, not toward her but away, into the dark beyond the yard. The man at the corner of the house had similarly vanished in the interval when she'd been watching the paddock. She went back inside because the back step was exposure without cover, and she wasn't going to stand there being visible. She reloaded. Silas came through the front door 4 minutes later with Tom right behind him, and she was at the kitchen table with the lamp finally lit and the shotgun across her knees. And she looked at Silas's face for blood because the shot she'd heard from the front was unaccounted for. "You're hit," she said. "I'm not—" He touched his shoulder and looked at his hand, and his expression was the expression of a man who had not realized until that moment. "It grazed me." "Sit down." "Clara Young." "Sit down, Silas." He sat down. Tom stood in the doorway with a rifle and his dog pressing against his leg, and through the window the barn was still burning, and she had Silas's coat off and his shirt pulled from the shoulder before he'd finished objecting. The wound was a graze. The bullet had cut along the outside of the left shoulder, not deep, but long, bleeding steadily. She had what she needed in the kitchen. She'd put together a basic medical kit in January because practicality. She cleaned it with whiskey from the shelf and packed it with clean cloth, and he made one sharp, involuntary sound and then sat still and let her work. "4 of them," Silas said to Tom, over her head. "We saw 2 running north," Tom said. "The Hennessy boys are on the east road." "Good." Silas winced. "Stop pressing so hard." "Stop moving," Clara said. Tom went and checked the cellar, and they heard him call to Noah, and Noah's voice came back thin and controlled, and a few minutes later they were both in the kitchen. Noah, with his face pale and set, looking at his uncle's shoulder, and Tom with the expression of a man who was quietly, steadily furious. "Who's in the barn?" Noah asked. "No one," Clara said. "The cattle are out. The horses are in the paddock." She looked at him directly. "Everyone's all right. The barn's burning." "The barn's burning," she agreed. "We'll deal with it." He looked at Silas's bandaged shoulder. His jaw did the thing it did when he was holding something. "Come here," Silas said. Noah went to him, and Silas put his good arm around the boy's shoulders briefly and said, "We're all right. The house is standing. Everyone's here." Noah pressed his face into Silas's side for about 4 seconds, then pulled away and stood straight and said, "What do we need to do?" Tom laughed, a short, surprise sound. Clara had to look away and find something to do with her hands. They saved most of the barn. The south wall was lost, and the hay that had been stacked against it, and 2 harnesses that had been hanging on the south side. Hector arrived at some point before dawn. Word had reached him through the Hennessy boys, and he and Tom and Silas worked the bucket line while Clara managed the horses, who were lathered and half wild with fear, and Noah ran water from the well with a focus that would have broken her heart if she'd let it. By sunrise the fire was out and the barn was standing on 3 walls. The men who'd attacked had gone. The Hennessy brothers had found one of them on the east road, a young man who'd twisted an ankle in the dark and couldn't run, and had brought him in to the county sheriff in Red Bluff under circumstances they described as he came along willingly in a way that suggested willingly was a relative term. The others had disappeared into the country. The county sheriff was a man named Dodd, who Clara had met once and assessed as a man who preferred situations not to be complicated. He was not, she thought, in Crane's pocket. He was too fundamentally timid for that kind of alliance. But he was also not a man who was going to pursue 4 armed night riders with particular aggression. He came out to the ranch mid-morning, looked at the barn and Silas's shoulder, wrote something in a notebook and said he'd look into it. "The man the Hennessy brothers brought in," Clara said. "Is he talking?" "He's not saying much," Dodd said. "He should be encouraged to say more." She held his eye. "We have a lawyer in Missoula who has already filed with the Territorial Attorney General. When the federal land agent comes, Sheriff, they're going to want to know whether local law enforcement was cooperative." Dodd looked at her with an expression that was not quite liking and not quite dislike, but something in between. The expression of a man who had been put on notice in a way he couldn't object to directly. "I'll speak to him again," Dodd said. After Dodd left, Tom sat at the kitchen table and said bluntly, "That was Crane." "We can't prove it yet," Silas said. "We don't need to prove it to know it." Tom looked at the table. "They burned the barn. They grazed you. Clara fired a shotgun at a man in your backyard." He paused. "This is past the point of waiting for lawyers." "The lawyers are the point," Clara said. "The lawyers are the reason we win this instead of just surviving it." She looked at Tom, and she meant what she was saying in a deep and specific way. "If we go after Crane directly, we lose. We're ranchers and a housekeeper against a man with money and men and probably the ear of half the county officials. The only place we can beat him is where he's actually weak. In the documentation, in the law, in the federal record." Tom was quiet. 3 months, she said. Belle said months. We're 2 months in. We give it 1 more month, and if the Attorney General hasn't moved, we go to Helena ourselves. He looked at her for a long moment, then at Silas, who gave him the slight nod that meant I'm with her on this. 1 month, Tom said, and in that month I'm sleeping here 3 nights a week. Agnes will have something to say about that, Silas said. Agnes told me to say it, Tom said. I'm not arguing with her. Done. It was 4 days after the barn attack, on a Sunday evening, when the morality complaint arrived. It came through Dodd, which told Clara something about who'd arranged it, because Dodd was not the kind of man who generated paperwork spontaneously. It was a formal complaint under the territorial morality statutes, citing the cohabitation of an unmarried woman with a man to whom she bears no relation, and it named Clara Whitmore and Silas Mercer, and demanded a response within 30 days. She read it at the kitchen table while Silas stood by the window. Noah was in bed. She read it twice. Then she set it down. He's trying another angle, she said. If he can't burn us out, he damages our standing with the complaint, makes the community see us as... She stopped. She was not going to use the word the complaint was implying. I know what it's saying, Silas said. We have a contract, she said. It specifies the nature of the arrangement. A contract won't matter if this goes in front of a judge who's sympathetic to Crane. She knew that. She'd known it the moment she'd read the first line. The contract was protection against honest misunderstanding, not against deliberate political manipulation. She sat with it for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, Tom was in the guest room. He'd been sleeping there since Tuesday, Agnes's instruction, and she was grateful for it in a way she hadn't said aloud. There's an obvious solution, she said. Silas turned from the window. If we were married, she said, the complaint is groundless. It goes away and it doesn't come back. The word married sat in the air between them with the particular weight of a word that meant several things at once. She was not romantic about it. She was clear-eyed about what she was saying and what it would mean and why she was saying it. It was a practical solution to a legal problem, the same kind of solution she'd been finding since October. A marriage of convenience, Silas said. His voice was even, but she couldn't read what was under it. A legal arrangement, she said, to remove a legal vulnerability. You'd still have the contract from October as the basis of the working arrangement. We just add the... She paused. The additional documentation. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched his face, and she couldn't tell what he was working through, and she was not good at waiting for things she couldn't read, but she sat still and waited. No, he said. She looked at him. Not a convenience, he said. Not a document. He came away from the window and pulled a chair out and sat down across from her, which he rarely did. He usually sat at the end of the table. Sitting directly across from her was a different posture, more direct, less comfortable. I'm not going to marry you because of a legal problem, Clara. Then we need to think about what else. That's not what I'm saying. He stopped her. He said it quietly, but it was a stop, and she stopped. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw him gathering something, the way he gathered himself before he said something he'd been holding. I'm saying I'm not going to ask you to marry me because of a complaint filed by a corrupt cattle baron trying to destroy us, he said. I'm going to ask you to marry me because you've been the heart of this family since November, and I've known it since Christmas, and I've been trying to figure out if it's the wrong moment to say it. He paused. And maybe it still is the wrong moment, but you just suggested marrying me as a paperwork solution, and I can't let that stand. She looked at him. She recognized, not prepared for this. She'd been prepared for many things in the last 5 months. She had not been specifically prepared for Silas Mercer, at a kitchen table at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night, with the barn half burned and a morality complaint on the table between them, saying what he'd just said. Silas, she said. You don't have to answer tonight, he said. This isn't a demand. I know you've had reasons to be careful. I know there are things you haven't told me and you don't have to tell me. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you what's true. What you do with it is yours. The fire went on burning. The house was quiet around them. She thought about 11 cents and a letter for a job that didn't exist. She thought about sitting in the mud with her boot falling apart and 20 people looking the other way. She thought about this kitchen in the first week, cold and disordered and gray, and she thought about it now with the lamp burning right and the floor solid under her feet and Noah's books on the shelf and the gloves she'd made, which were hanging on the peg by the door where Silas kept them. She thought about the husband she'd had once, who'd used her carefully and discarded her without ceremony, and how she'd told herself after that she was done with trusting in those particular structures. She'd believed it. For a long time it had been true. She was not sure it was still true. I'm not going to answer tonight, she said. But I'm not saying no. He nodded. He didn't push. She picked up the morality complaint and put it under the letter from Bell and said, The complaint goes to Bell tomorrow. He needs to know about this strategy. Agreed, Silas said. They sat at the table for another half hour, going through what needed to be done in the morning, and then they said goodnight and went to their separate rooms. And Clara lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She'd made that clear, she thought, in the general course of the last several months. But what Silas had said at the table frightened her in a way that 4 armed men in a dark yard did not, because the thing at the table asked something of her that she'd kept carefully locked away. And she was not sure she knew anymore whether the lock was protecting her or just keeping her in the dark. She got up at 5 and made the coffee and stood at the kitchen window while the dawn came up slow and pink over the mountains. And she thought about what it felt like to be in a house that felt like somewhere she wanted to be. She thought about that for a long time. When she heard Silas's boots on the stairs, she poured a second cup and set it on the table at his usual place. And when he came in and saw it, he sat down without saying anything. And she sat down across from him with her own cup, and they sat in the early light with the mountains brightening outside the window. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Just looked. Not just because of the complaint, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know, he said. I'm not easy to be with, she said. I move fast, and I don't always say things before I do them, and I have parts of my past that are not small, and I've been keeping them away from everyone for a long time. She looked at her coffee. I'm not promising to be simple. I didn't ask for simple, Silas said. I asked for you. She looked up. He said it the way he said most things, not as a performance, not dressed up for effect, just the plain true statement of it offered across the table in the early light. All right, she said. All right, he said. They married the following Saturday in May's diner, because May was the only one they both trusted to make it feel real without making it feel like theater. Tom and Agnes were there. Hector wore his good shirt and appeared to find the entire occasion unsurprising. Noah stood next to Silas in a shirt that Clara had altered to fit him properly. And he didn't say anything during the brief ceremony, but when it was done, he looked up at Clara with his steady dark eyes and said, Do I call you something different now? She crouched down so she was at his level. What would you like to call me? He thought about it, seriously, the way he thought about everything. Clara, he said. But I wanted to ask. Clara's fine, she said. Come on, May made cake. The cake was 3 layers and imperfect. May had said this herself, preemptively, before anyone could comment, and it was the best thing Clara had eaten in longer than she could specifically remember. Outside, the March sky was sharp and clear, and the mountains were white and very close-looking the way they got in cold weather. The barn was still missing its south wall. The morality complaint was on its way to Garrett Bell. Rutherford Crane was, somewhere, doing whatever men like Crane did when they realized they hadn't finished something. But in May's diner, at a table by the window, there was cake, and there were people who'd shown up because they meant to, and Noah was explaining to Agnes's youngest daughter the precise anatomical differences between a mule deer and a whitetail, citing the natural history book, and Tom had his arm around Agnes's shoulders, and Hector was on his 3rd cup of coffee and appeared content. And Silas was next to Clara with his bandaged shoulder and his plain good face, and he caught her looking at him and said nothing, just looked back. She looked back at him. That was enough, for right now. That was in fact quite a lot. The south wall of the barn went back up in April. It took 3 weekends, and the labor of Tom and the Hennessy brothers, and Hector, and a man named Cutter, who was Stuart Greer's son-in-law, and had come along because he'd heard what happened and had opinions about men who burned other men's barns in the night. Nobody asked him to come, and nobody turned him away. He showed up the first Saturday with a hammer and a lunch pail and worked from 7 in the morning until the light gave out. And he did this all 3 weekends. And on the last day when the wall was standing and the new boards were pale against the weathered old ones, he shook Silas's hand and said, "It's a good barn," and drove home. Clara watched this from the porch and thought about what it meant when people decided which side of something they were on. The community had shifted. It had shifted slowly and not completely. There were still people in Red Bluff who took their opinions from Martha Holt and who watched Clara and Silas in town with measuring eyes. But the attack on the ranch had done something to the social arithmetic that neither Beaumont nor Crane had apparently anticipated. People on the frontier understood, in a concrete and personal way, what it meant for a barn to be set on fire in the night. They'd all known it as a possibility for their own places, a fear they carried quietly through dry summers and drought years. And when it became real at the Mercer Ranch, it stopped being abstract. The Hennessy brothers had been carrying that anger since March. Agnes had organized, without exactly announcing that she was organizing, a kind of informal information network among the ranch wives in the valley, who'd heard what, when Crane's men had been spotted where, what the sheriff had or hadn't done. It was not political exactly. It was just women sharing information because information was the thing that had been kept from them, and they'd decided they were done with that. Garrett Bell wrote in April that the Territorial Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation. It was the letter they'd been waiting for, and Clara read it 3 times before she trusted herself to present it to Silas without her voice doing something she didn't want it to do. The investigation would focus on fraudulent modification of loan terms, conspiracy to defraud, and illegal foreclosure proceedings. Bell's language was careful as always. This is a significant development but does not guarantee a specific outcome or timeline. But the careful language contained, for the first time, something that felt like genuine momentum. "How long now?" Silas said. "He doesn't say, but he says the investigator has requested records from the First Territorial Bank directly, which means they're treating this as a serious criminal matter." She looked up. They're past the stage of deciding whether to investigate. Silas sat with that for a moment, then said, "Crane's going to know. He may already know. He's going to move." She believed that too. She'd been believing it since March, since the morality complaint had failed and the barn attack had failed and the community response had made it clear that burning out the Mercers was going to be more publicly visible than Crane had planned. A man like that didn't stop. He reassessed and he tried something else. And what he tried next would either be smarter or more desperate, and she wasn't certain which was more dangerous. She wrote to Bell that same afternoon asking specifically whether the investigation extended to the land company and Wesley Crane, whether Beaumont had been contacted, and whether their own documentation, the payment records, the bank correspondence, the ledger comparisons she'd assembled over 5 months, had been formally received. She wanted a record that they'd cooperated fully. She wanted a record of everything. Belle's reply came back inside 2 weeks, which was fast. It confirmed that Wesley Crane's land company was part of the investigation. It confirmed that Beaumont had been served notice. And it included a line that she read twice and then set down flat on the table. I have been informed by a contact in the territorial office that the parties under investigation may be aware of the scope of the inquiry and are taking active steps to interfere with its progress. She showed Silas. He read it and said nothing for a moment. Active steps, he said. Belle doesn't say what kind. He knows what kind. Silas set the letter down. They already tried the fire and the morality complaint. What's left? The witness, she said. He looked at her. The man the Hennessy brothers brought in, she said. The one with the twisted ankle. If he's talking to the investigators, he's the link between Crane and the attack on this ranch. Without him, it's arson with no proven origin. With him, she stopped. He's in the county jail, Silas said. He's in Dodds County Jail, she corrected. And Dodd's not someone I'd stake a man's safety on. They looked at each other across the table with the letter between them. And she felt the particular cold clarity that came when a situation stripped away everything unnecessary and left just the shape of what it was. I'm going to write to Belle tonight, she said, about the witness. Do that, Silas said. May came in warm, which was both a relief and a different kind of problem, because the warmth that brought the grass back also brought Crane's operation back into full motion. He'd been acquiring land in 2 other valleys east of Bluff Valley, his name appearing in land office records that Belle's colleague had pulled. And his operation in the Bluff was not, apparently, something he'd decided to abandon. Tom came over on a Thursday morning looking like a man who hadn't slept well. Someone cut the fence on my north boundary, he said. 3 posts pulled, cattle scattered into the Henderson section. The Henderson section was now Crane's land. Cattle that wandered onto Crane's land could be claimed as strays and sold. How many? Silas said. I got most of them back. Lost 2 head. Tom's jaw was tight. Dodd said he'd look into it, which is what Dodd says. Clara poured coffee and set it in front of Tom and sat down. How's the fence normally? Fine. I maintain it. He wrapped his hands around the cup. This wasn't age or weather. The posts were pulled. Someone did it deliberate. When? Clara asked. Night before last. I found it yesterday morning. She and Silas exchanged a look. Night before last was the same night she'd heard the horses restless again. She hadn't gotten up this time because she'd been exhausted and told herself it was nothing. They're still watching the properties, she said. They're shifting from direct attack to attrition. Fence lines, cattle, making it difficult to operate. She looked at Tom. This is going to happen again. I know. And to others. I know that too. He drank his coffee. What do? We document it, she said. Every incident, every date, everything. Belle needs a pattern, not just a single event. If they're doing this systematically... She paused, thinking through it. Has Stuart Greer had any trouble? He didn't say. I'll write to him. And the Hennessy's. She pulled her notebook toward her. We build the record. Every fence line cut, every head of cattle lost, every strange vehicle on a road after dark. It goes in the record. Tom looked at her the way people sometimes looked at her when she moved fast. Not resistance exactly, more like the slight breathlessness of keeping up. There's a lot of documentation in this business, he said. Documentation is what's going to put Rutherford Crane in a jail cell, she said. Yes, there's a lot of it. Tom finished his coffee and went home with the expression of a man who had decided to trust someone else's map because he was out of his own ideas. She respected that. It took a particular kind of honesty to know when to follow someone else's lead. Noah finished his schoolwork in May and started spending his afternoons helping Hector in ways that Hector seemed to find genuinely useful rather than indulgent. He'd developed an aptitude for mechanical things that Clara suspected he'd gotten from his father's side. Silas's sister's husband had been a man who could fix anything, by all accounts, and he'd taken to sitting with Hector while he worked and handing tools and asking questions and remembering the answers. He'd also, quietly and without announcing it, started reading the legal correspondence. Clara discovered this when she came to the kitchen table one afternoon to find her copy of Belle's latest letter, not quite where she'd left it, at a slightly different angle. and Noah at the far end of the table with a school book that he was not reading. She sat down. "Did you read the letter?" she said. A pause. "I wasn't supposed to." "I didn't say you weren't supposed to. I asked if you did." Another pause, more honest. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. He was 9 now, nearly 10, and the year had done things to him that were hard to name precisely. Not hardened him, that wasn't quite right, but filled in some of the places that grief had emptied. He was still a serious child. He was also, increasingly, a curious and engaged one. "What did you understand?" she said. He thought about this with the care he gave to questions he wanted to answer accurately. "The Attorney General is investigating. Bell thinks they'll move on Beaumont by summer, but he doesn't know about Crane yet. The evidence connecting Crane to the attack is still thin." He paused. "The man in the county jail is important." "Yes," she said. "He is." "What's going to happen to him?" "I don't know," she said. "That's one of the things we're watching." Noah was quiet, looking at the table. Then, "Is it hard? Doing all this and not just—" He stopped, searching for the word. "Not just confronting them." She smiled, a small one. "Yes, it's hard. Your uncle finds it very hard." She looked at the window. "But confronting someone who has more men and money than you is satisfying for about 30 seconds, and then you lose. The law is slower, and it's frustrating, and it's uncertain. But if it works completely." She looked back at him. "That's the bet we're making." He thought about that seriously. "What if it doesn't work?" "Then we find another approach," she said. "But we don't know yet that it won't." He seemed to find this adequate, if not entirely comforting. He went back to the school book. After a moment he said, without looking up, "I want to be a lawyer." She didn't react with the over-warmth that would have embarrassed him. She said, "You'd be good at it." He didn't say anything back, but she could see from the side of his face that he was pleased. "What?" The summer settled into a wary and productive calm, which was itself a kind of tension. Clara had rebuilt the reserve to $90. Between the laundry and mending and Hector's outside work and careful management, the operation was running slightly positive most months. And Silas had the herd in good condition, the cattle heavier than they'd been the previous fall. The south wall of the barn was indistinguishable from the other walls now, the new wood weathering toward gray. They'd planted a kitchen garden in April, and it was doing well enough. They were also, in a way that was separate from the legal situation, figuring out how to be married. It was not simple. She'd warned him it wouldn't be, and she'd been accurate. She was a woman who'd spent years making decisions autonomously, out of necessity, not preference, and the muscle memory of that didn't dissolve because she'd said yes at a table in May's diner. She still moved fast when she saw the shape of something. She still occasionally did things and told him after. He'd say her name in that particular flat tone, and she'd acknowledge it, and they'd talk through it, and they'd be fine. But the talking through required effort from both of them, and effort was not always available in the amounts required. He was not easy either. He went silent when he was troubled. A silence that was nothing like Noah's old silence, but was still hard to reach past if he didn't want to be reached. He had a stubbornness that was deeply embedded, not mean, not unreasonable, but dense, the kind of stubbornness that was part of the same material as his reliability and couldn't be separated from it. There were evenings when they sat at the kitchen table and the conversation was economical and neither of them pushed, and she'd go to bed uncertain whether it was comfortable easiness or something quiet and harder. But there were also mornings when she came down and the coffee was already made because he'd heard her up before she'd come downstairs. And evenings when he'd come in from the range and find her at the kitchen table with the account books and sit down across from her without being asked, because by now the account books were a thing they managed together. There was the night in June when a calf got stuck in a fence line and they'd worked it free together in the dark, kneeling in the mud in the cold, and she'd been laughing by the end of it because the calf had opinions about being handled and expressed them loudly. And Silas had been laughing too, and they'd come inside muddy and cold and she'd thought, putting water on for washing, this is what it is, this is the actual texture of it, and she'd found it enough. She'd found it more than enough, honestly, but she was still careful with that. Careful was old armor, and it didn't come off all at once. The letter from Garrett Bell arrived in the last week of July, and it changed everything in 48 hours. Beaumont had cooperated. He'd been served notice in May, and had spent 2 months deciding that his choices were cooperate or face the full weight of the fraud charge alone, and he'd chosen cooperation. He had, according to Bell's letter, provided testimony implicating Rutherford Crane and Wesley Crane's land company in a coordinated scheme running across 11 properties in 3 valleys over 4 years. He had documentation, his own records, which he'd apparently kept with the self-protective instinct of a man who always wanted something to trade, showing the specific instructions from Crane, the timing of the loan adjustments coordinated with the land company's acquisition schedule, and the payments that had moved between them. The man in the county jail had also, faced with Beaumont's testimony making his own silence irrelevant, confirmed that he'd been hired through one of Crane's foremen to set the fire at the Mercer barn and intimidate the occupants. Federal marshals have been dispatched, Bell wrote. I expect arrests within the week. I would advise you to remain on the property and to be prepared for the possibility that events may move quickly. There may be an attempt to destroy evidence or to intimidate witnesses before the marshals arrive. Please take whatever precautions you consider appropriate. Clara read the letter standing at the kitchen window at 7 in the morning, and when she'd read it through, she called Silas in from the barn. He read it. She watched his face. A week, he said. Or less. Bell doesn't know the exact timing. We need to tell Tom. Hector's already gone to him. She'd sent Hector as soon as she'd read the first paragraph, on instinct, because Bell's warning about the window before the arrests was the sentence that mattered most immediately. Silas set the letter on the table. Crane's going to hear about Beaumont before the marshals get here. Yes, she said. He almost certainly already has. They looked at each other. Then he's got nothing left to lose, Silas said. Or nothing left to protect, she said, which is different. Men with nothing to protect are more dangerous than men protecting something. The next 36 hours had a particular quality she'd recognize for the rest of her life. The hyperclarity of waiting for something you know is coming, but can't see yet. She put the legal documents in a tin box and hid it in the root cellar. She made sure the rifles were loaded and the shotgun was accessible. She wrote a letter to Bell with the full current address and the date, in case something happened and there needed to be a record of when they'd received his warning. Tom came over Tuesday morning with the Hennessy brothers and old Stuart Greer, who'd driven his own wagon and brought a rifle that was older than half the people present and appeared entirely serviceable. Nobody had organized this exactly. Tom had told Greer, Greer had told the Hennessys had loaded their rifles. It was the informal web of the valley folding into something with structure. They sat at the big kitchen table. 6 men plus Clara. Noah sent upstairs to read with instructions to come down only if someone called his name. And they talked through what they knew and what they expected. The conversation was practical and not very long because the shape of it was fairly simple. They would stay, they would be visible about staying, and if Crane's men came, they would not find an empty house and a dark ranch. We don't fire first, Silas said. Whatever happens, we don't fire first. Agreed, Tom said. The others nodded. But if they fire, then we respond in kind, Greer said, in his flat way. He was 70 years old and had been on his land for 30 and had a manner suggesting he'd been through enough that this particular situation registered as serious but not unprecedented. Understood. Clara looked at them all, Tom with his jaw set, the Hennessy brothers who were somewhere in their 30s and looked like men who'd been doing physical work since childhood, Greer with his ancient composure, Hector quiet at the end of the table. Silas at the head of it. She'd sat in the mud in the middle of Red Bluff in October. She'd had 11 cents in a carpet bag and a boot held together with burlap. She'd fixed this kitchen floor and replastered this chimney and rebuilt these relationships from nothing, and she was sitting at this table because she'd refused to leave when it got hard. We hold the house, she said. Whatever they do, we hold the house. Nobody argued with that. They came before sunrise on a Thursday morning in the first week of August, and they came in numbers that told Clara that Crane had made his decision about what this was. Not intimidation this time, not arson at the edges, but an ending. She heard them before she saw them. Horses on the road, too many for a casual passage, and then voices, low and directional, the kind of voices that were being kept quiet because quiet was part of the plan. She was already awake, had been since 4, sleeping in the way of someone who is mostly listening. She was at Silas's door before the first shape crossed the fence line. They're here, she said. He was out of bed in 3 seconds. She went to Noah's room. The boy was awake, sitting up, and she could see in his face that he'd been waiting too, the way children wait when they've been told to expect something and have been lying in the dark listening. "Root cellar," she said. "Right now, the same as before. Take the lantern, keep it low." "How many?" Noah said. She didn't have an exact answer. "Enough, go." He went without argument, which told her everything about how he'd grown since January, the particular dignity of a child who trusted the plan because the people making it had earned it. She came back into the hall and Silas was already there, rifle in hand, moving to the window at the end of the hall that gave the best angle on the yard. Downstairs she heard Hector and Tom moving. The Hennessy brothers had the ground floor. Greer had the position by the kitchen window, which had the widest angle. Through the hall window she could see them now, 5, 6, more shapes behind them, coming through the gate and spreading across the yard in the practiced way of men who'd been told where to go. They had rifles. At least one of them had something else, something he was carrying with both hands, and she knew what it was. "Silas," she said, "I see it." A voice from the yard. "Mercer, come out and we settle this without burning it down." The voice was not Crane's. It was a foreman's voice, someone paid to be in front. Silas called from the window. "You're on private property. Turn around and leave." "We can do this the hard way." A pause. "Last chance." "You want to talk about last chances," Silas said. "Consider that there are federal marshals coming to this valley inside of 48 hours. Beaumont has already talked. Every man in that yard is a witness to everything that's happened on this property, and they're all going to be interviewed." Another pause. "Leave now, and that's still possible. Stay." A shot. Not from the house, from the yard, a crack that took out the upper left pane of the hall window and sent glass across the floor. Silas pulled back from the window. Clara was already below the sill. "That's their answer," Silas said. "That's their answer," she agreed. From downstairs, one of the Hennessy brothers. "They're moving to the barn side." "Don't let them reach it." Silas's voice, level and specific. What followed was not a clean or cinematic thing. It was confused and loud and frightening in ways that were mostly about the darkness and the uncertainty of what was where. The men in the yard were trying to split attention between the front and the back, and there were enough of them that they could try both at once, and the people in the house were trying to cover both, and couldn't see clearly enough to be confident about anything. Clara took the back of the house. She was at the kitchen window with the shotgun, and Greer was beside her with his old rifle, and they watched the backyard together in the dark. And the particular thing she felt was not courage exactly. It was more like a narrowing. Everything that was not immediately relevant falling away, leaving just what was in front of her and what she needed to do about it. 2 men came around the south side of the barn. She and Greer fired at nearly the same moment. She aimed above and ahead, and the sound was the point, and Greer's shot was better aimed than hers, and one of the 2 men went down to one knee, not dead, but down. The other pulled back around the barn. "Good shot," she said to Greer. "I've had practice," he said, in his dry way, already reloading. From the front of the house, heavier fire, and she heard something hit the wall outside. Not a bullet, something bigger, something thrown, and then smelled it. "Fire," she said. "Front porch," Greer said. She left the kitchen window and went to the front hall, where the smell was stronger, and through the narrow front window she could see a tongue of flame at the base of the porch steps, where something had been thrown and ignited. Not large yet, but growing. Tom and one of the Hennessy brothers were at the front windows. Tom said, without turning, "We can't get to it from here without going out." "We're not going out," Clara said. She looked around and her mind moved fast, the way it did when it had to. The water barrel in the kitchen. Full. She'd filled it yesterday. The mop bucket. The pot on the stove. "Get water. We'll take the side window." She did not do things gracefully in the next 5 minutes. She hauled water from the kitchen and passed it to Tom through the side window while a Hennessy brother laid down suppressing fire from the front. And the first bucket didn't reach far enough, and the second one did, and the third one, which Tom threw with the full force of his frustration, put the fire out. He came back in with scorched eyebrows and a grim look, and she said, "Thank you." And he said, "That's the second time they've tried to fire this place," and sat back at his window. From upstairs, Silas's voice. "Riders!" She went upstairs. Through the hall window she could see them. Not from the yard, from the road, horses at speed from the north, more than she could count in the dark. And for one lurching moment she thought it was reinforcements for Crane, and then she heard the sound that separated them from everything that had been happening in the last hour. "Federal marshals," Silas said. She said nothing. She pressed her back against the wall, and she breathed. "Masham." What happened in the yard after the marshals arrived was something she pieced together afterward from what different people told her, because she was in the house and couldn't see all of it, and things were still confused for 20 minutes. The men in the yard, 7 of them in the end, which was more than she'd thought, were not inclined to fight federal authority the way they'd been willing to fight a ranch family. Several of them put down their weapons before they were asked. The foreman who'd done the talking tried to ride east and was run down before he'd made a quarter mile. Silas came downstairs when it was clear, and she went upstairs to get Noah from the cellar. He'd been down there for over an hour in the dark with a low lantern, and he'd been reading. He'd brought Ivanhoe, the one they'd started reading together in October. She'd never finished it in the evenings because there was always something else, and he'd gotten himself 30 pages further in. "You were reading," she said. "It was either that or just be scared," he said. He climbed up the cellar steps and looked around the kitchen. "Is it done?" "It's done," she said. "Come on." In the yard, in the first gray light of dawn, the marshals were a business-like presence that asked questions and accepted answers and took the names of everyone present. Their lead marshal was a compact man named Fielding, who had the patience of someone who did this professionally and the eyes of someone who'd learned not to be surprised by what people did to each other over land. He spoke to Silas first, then to Clara, then separately to Tom and Greer and the Hennessy brothers. He took the tin box of documents that Clara brought up from the root cellar, 5 months of meticulous records, and receipted it formally, which she appreciated. He spoke to the Hennessy brothers about what they'd witnessed that night. He spoke briefly and privately with the foreman who'd been brought back and who was now significantly more cooperative than he'd been when he'd had men in the yard behind him. Fielding came back to Clara after this last conversation. "Rutherford Crane was taken into custody in Billings last night," he said. "His brother Wesley was taken this morning in Helena. Several members of their operation have been arrested in connection with the incident at this property and properties in 2 other valleys." Clara heard this. She heard it the way you heard something you'd been working toward for 8 months. Not with shock, because she'd believed it was possible, but with a weight of relief that was almost physical, that pressed down through her chest and let something go that had been held very tight. "And Beaumont?" she said. "He's cooperated fully. He'll face charges, but he'll be treated as a cooperative witness." Fielding paused. "The documentation you provided to Garrett Bell has been formally entered into the federal record. It will be central to the prosecution." She nodded. She was not going to let herself cry in the yard in front of a federal marshal, and she wasn't going to, but it was a decision she had to make deliberately. "The affected properties," she said, "the ones that were taken, sold under duress, foreclosed, that's a longer process," Fielding said. He was direct about it, which she respected. "The legal resolution will take time, but the criminal matter is essentially resolved, and the land records will be audited as part of that." He paused. "There's a man named Morrow in town. We'll need to speak with him." "He'll want to hear from you," she said. Fielding thanked her and went to speak to Silas again. She stood in the yard in the August dawn, and the sun was just coming over the mountain to the east, and the light was the particular gold of early morning on the frontier, flat and clear and without sentiment. The barn was solid behind her, all 4 walls. The house was standing. The porch steps were scorched and would need to be replaced, which was going to be the 3rd time they'd done repair work that could be traced back to Crane, and this would be the last time. Hector appeared beside her, quiet as always, and stood looking at the yard where the marshals were still working. "Bien," he said, which was all he said. "Yes," she agreed. Noah came out of the house and stood on the porch, looking out at the marshals and the horses and the thin morning light on everything. He was still holding Ivanhoe. He looked at Clara. "Is Roy Morrow going to get his ranch back?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said, "but the people who took it are going to have to answer for it. That's the start." He thought about this. Then he came down off the porch and stood beside her, and he looked out at the valley the same way she was looking at it, not like it was someone else's concern, but like it was his. Silas came across the yard from where he'd been speaking with Fielding, and he stopped when he reached them and looked at the ranch in the morning light, the same look he'd had the first evening she'd seen it, that look of a man who understood the weight of what he was responsible for. He put his arm around her shoulders. She let him. "It's over," he said. "Most of it," she said. "The rest is paperwork." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Of course it is. I'm good at paperwork," she said. "I know you are," he said. "God help us. I know." She looked at him sideways. "Figuratively," he said. "Obviously," she said. Noah was listening to this with the expression he wore when he found adults puzzling but not unpleasant, and the morning was coming fully up around them, gold on the mountains and the valley, opening out below the ranch in all directions. And somewhere in the county jail in Red Bluff, a foreman was talking, and in Billings and Helena, two brothers were finding out what it felt like when the thing you'd been building on paper finally collapsed into the actual world. And on the front porch of Red Bluff Ranch, 8 people had just held a house against 7 armed men in a fire. And they'd held it, and the house was standing, and everyone who'd come to defend it was still there to see the morning. That was not nothing. That was not, by any measure, nothing. The paperwork took 11 months. Clara had said it would, and she'd been right, and being right about it did not make it any easier to live through. The federal investigation moved the way large official things moved, with purpose and without hurry, grinding through documentation and testimony and counter-testimony and the various legal maneuvers of the Crane brothers' lawyers, who were expensive and competent, and who slowed everything they touched by 30 days minimum. Rutherford and Wesley Crane were not men who accepted consequences gracefully. They fought every charge, disputed every document, and spent considerable money trying to reframe the entire scheme as a series of misunderstandings between gentlemen. It didn't work. Beaumont's testimony was too specific and too well documented, and the records Clara had assembled over 8 months were the kind of evidence that didn't bend under pressure because they weren't interpretation. They were numbers, dates, and letters written by the defendants themselves. Garrett Bell argued the case before a federal judge in Helena in the spring of the following year, and both brothers were convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. Wesley received 7 years. Rutherford, whose operation had included the arson and the armed assault on the Mercer property, received 12. Clara read the verdict letter at the kitchen table on an April morning, with the window open and the sound of the ranch coming in on the breeze. Hector working something near the barn, a calf calling from the pasture, Noah's voice somewhere out back asking Silas a question she couldn't make out. She read it twice. Then she put it down and sat with it for a while, because it deserved that. 8 months of careful, grinding, unglamorous work deserved more than a quick read and a nod. Silas came in from outside and looked at her face and said, "Bell's letter?" "Guilty on all counts," she said, "both of them." He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. He was not a demonstrative man. She knew that by now, knew it in the specific way you knew a person's particular shape after sharing a life with them. And he didn't whoop or slam his hand on the door frame. He came to the table and he sat down and he picked up the letter and read it himself, all the way through, same as she had. When he set it down, she said, "Roy Morrow." "I know," he said. Roy Morrow was the part of this that mattered in a different way. The criminal conviction was one thing. The land was another. The audit of the Crane Land Company's acquisitions had confirmed what they'd suspected, that multiple properties in the valley had been obtained through the fraudulent scheme, and the federal process for returning those properties was, as Marshal Fielding had warned, a longer road than the criminal case. It required establishing what each property had been worth at the time of its acquisition, what the seller had received, and what remedy was appropriate. Roy Morrow had sold his ranch for 40 cents on the dollar, under financial pressure that had been deliberately manufactured. His lawyer, Bell, who'd taken his case as part of the larger matter, was arguing for full restitution of the land or its current market value. The Crane estate, stripped by legal fees and the requirements of the criminal judgment, had less than the lawyers had hoped. It was going to be a partial settlement. Not everything. Clara had written to Roy in November before the verdict, telling him what the case looked like and what he might realistically expect. She'd done it because she thought he deserved an honest accounting rather than hope that might not survive contact with reality. He'd written back a letter that was short and measured and that said, "Among other things, I want you to know that whatever comes of this, knowing what happened and why is worth something by itself." Agnes was right that you were someone to trust. She'd kept that letter. It was in the tin box with the rest of the documentation, which she'd kept because you kept things like that. Not for sentiment exactly, for accuracy. Because the accurate record of what had happened was the thing that meant it hadn't happened to nothing. I want to go see him, Clara said. When it's settled, I want to go in person. We'll go together, Silas said. The settlement came through in June. Roy Morrow received partial restitution, not the full value of the ranch, because the Crane estate couldn't cover it, but enough to buy a smaller parcel north of Red Bluff and start again. He was 43 years old, which was not young for starting again on the frontier, and he knew it. And he said so when they sat on his new porch the afternoon Clara and Silas drove out to see him. It's not the same, he said. He was a compact, sunburned man who looked like someone had built him for hard use, and he said things plainly, without self-pity, but without pretending either. I know it's not the same. My wife and I built that place board by board. I know every fence post on it. He looked out at his smaller land. This is different land. It's good land, Silas said. It is. Roy was quiet for a moment. I'm not complaining. I want to be clear about that. I know what you did. Both of you. I know what it cost. He looked at Clara. You could have just protected your own place. We tried that first, she said. It didn't work. You can't protect your own place when the problem is bigger than your own place. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was deciding whether to say something. What? She said. I spent 2 years thinking I failed, he said. That's what I want you to understand. 2 years thinking I was the kind of man who couldn't hold on to what he'd built, that I'd done something wrong, made bad decisions, not worked hard enough. He stopped. Turns out I was just being robbed. She held his eyes. Yes, she said. You were. That's different, he said. It shouldn't matter as much as it does, but it's different. She thought about that on the drive home, the wagon rocking over the summer road and the valley spread out around them in the long evening light. She thought about how much of what people believed about themselves was built on the story of what had happened to them, and how a false story, I failed, I wasn't enough, I couldn't hold on, could do damage that the actual event hadn't, because the actual event was just a thing that happened. But the wrong story about why it happened followed you everywhere. Roy Morrow had worked hard and built something and been robbed of it by men who'd counted on him never finding out. The finding out mattered, not because it gave him everything back, it didn't, but because it gave him back the accurate version of himself. She thought that was maybe the most useful thing the whole long enterprise had accomplished, and it was not something she'd planned or expected. Silas, driving, said, You're thinking. I'm always thinking. You're thinking loudly. Roy, she said, I was thinking about what he said. About failing. Yes. She watched the road. It's what Crane and Beaumont were counting on, wasn't it? Not just that people couldn't keep up with the payments, but that they'd blame themselves for it. People who blame themselves don't look for other explanations. And people who look for other explanations, Silas said, write letters to bank directors in Helena. She glanced at him. He was looking at the road with the particular expression he got when he was saying something he meant, without fuss. I wrote those letters because I was angry, she said. I know. Not because I was noble. I know that too, he said. Doesn't matter why you started. Matters what you did. She let that sit for a while. It was the kind of thing he said rarely and meant completely, and she'd learned to let those things sit rather than deflecting them, which had been her first instinct with compliments and observations about her own worth, that particular old reflex of making yourself smaller so no one could accurately measure how much space you were taking up. She was working on that. It was slow work. The ranch took another 3 years to become what it became. Not because of drama. The drama was finished with the Crane verdict, and nothing after that rose to the level of armed men in the yard and fire on the porch. The 3 years were ordinary years, which was their own kind of richness. They were years of calves born and fences repaired and accounts that slowly, steadily moved from precarious to solid. Hector stayed, which she'd never taken for granted. He got a raise in the second year and a small share in the operation in the third, which he received with the equanimity with which he received most things, and which seemed to satisfy him, and which was fair. The mending and laundry work she'd started out of necessity, she'd gradually wound down as the ranch income stabilized, not because she stopped being capable of it, but because she had other things to do. She kept the account books. She managed the supply relationships and negotiated the contracts for their beef, which she did with the same patient, specific competence she'd brought to everything else. And she got prices that were better than Silas had gotten before because she was willing to let the negotiation take longer than the other party was comfortable with. Silas watched this with an expression she'd come to understand as quiet pride, the kind that didn't perform itself. "You could run this operation without me," he said once, after she'd finished a particularly extended conversation with a buyer from Missoula. "I could not run the cattle," she said, "or do what you do with the land. But the rest of it—" "The rest of it, yes." She looked at him. "But I wouldn't want to." He'd nodded, and she'd gone back to what she was doing, and that had been that. They had 2 children, a daughter first in the 2nd year of their marriage, a small and inconveniently opinionated person named Margaret after Silas's first wife, which had been Clara's suggestion and which had seemed right to both of them for reasons that were connected to the kind of respect that didn't require explanation. Maggie, as she became almost immediately, had her father's coloring and her mother's inclination to assess situations before committing to them. And she was walking before she'd finished being an infant, and talking before the walking was fully reliable, and she was trouble in the particular way of children who are very bright and have no fear. The second child was a boy, James, who arrived 2 years after Maggie and had Clara's brown eyes, and what appeared to be a fundamentally gentle nature that surprised both his parents, who were not, in the main, gentle people. He followed Hector around from the time he could walk and had an instinct for animals that Hector seemed to take a personal satisfaction in developing. Noah was 14 when James was born, and he received his small cousin with the same seriousness he brought to most things, holding him once with the careful attention of someone who understood that small things were fragile, and then handing him back to Clara with a look that said he respected the category without feeling personally called to it. He'd grown into a young man who was still spare with words and still read everything he could get his hands on, and his conviction about wanting to be a lawyer had not wavered. If anything, it had sharpened, fed by watching the entire legal process unfold from the inside, by reading Belle's letters, by sitting at the kitchen table when Belle came in person to prepare for the federal hearing, by asking Belle questions that Belle, to his credit, answered seriously rather than dismissing them as a child's curiosity. When Noah was 16, Belle wrote to Clara that he would be willing to take the boy on as a clerk in his Missoula office during the summer, if the family was agreeable. Clara showed the letter to Noah before she showed it to Silas. She wasn't sure why exactly. Maybe because it was his life and his letter, even if it had come to her address. He read it standing at the kitchen table, and his face did something she hadn't seen it do in a long time. It opened, the careful composure he wore like a second skin cracking slightly at the seams. "Belle wants me," he said. "Belle wants you," she confirmed. I thought he was being polite when he talked to me." "Belle doesn't do polite," she said. He does accurate. When he says you're capable, he means you're capable." Noah set the letter down and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her with those dark eyes that still sometimes gave her the feeling of looking at the 8-year-old who'd sat on the floor with a rope and listened to someone read the Pathfinder in the lamplight. "You're going to let me go," he said. It was not quite a question. "You're 16, she said. "Missoula is a day's ride. Belle's a decent man." She paused. "And you were never mine to keep." He looked at her for a moment longer than the sentence required. "I know that's not how you think of it," he said. He said it quietly, directly, the way he'd learned to say true things from watching adults who didn't flinch from them. "No," she said. "It's not." He went to Missoula that summer and the summer after, and the summer after that. He didn't come back in September because Belle had offered him a reading position that was functionally apprenticeship, and he wrote a letter explaining this that was 3 pages long and careful and included a paragraph about the ranch and the valley, and what they meant to him that she read once and then put in the tin box with the other things she kept for accuracy. He became a lawyer at 22. He came home for it, briefly, and sat at the kitchen table that had held so many things, and told Silas and Clara what he intended to do with the license. "Frontier families," he said. "Land cases, debt cases, cases like ours. There are a lot of people in this territory who don't know they're being robbed until it's too late." Belle's kind of work, Silas said. Belle's kind of work, Noah agreed. He's not getting younger, and there aren't enough people doing it. Clara thought about Roy Morrow on his porch, saying, I spent 2 years thinking I failed. She thought about the Morrow place, which a family named Birch had bought at auction after the Crane estate was liquidated, and which was a working ranch again and would have no connection to its own history until someone told them, which she had not yet done and was still deciding about. She thought about what it meant to have a nephew who wanted to spend his life making sure people understood why things had happened to them. You'll be good at it, she said. I know, Noah said, not with arrogance, but with the calm of someone who had made a fair assessment and wasn't going to qualify it to make other people comfortable. She'd taught him that, or he'd learned it from watching her. Either way, she recognized it, and it made her feel something she didn't try to name, because naming it would make it smaller. The years after that were not dramatic years, and she was glad of it. She'd had enough drama in the first year in Red Bluff to supply several ordinary lives, and what the ordinary years offered in exchange was something she'd underestimated from the outside. The texture of a life that was actually hers. Not hers by default, because there was nothing else. Not hers because someone had agreed to let her stay. Hers because she'd built it, piece by piece, from 11 cents and a bad letter and a man who'd stepped out of a crowd when everyone else was looking elsewhere. She was not under any illusions about the romance of that. The frontier was hard, and the ranch was hard, and there were years when the cattle prices dropped, and years when the weather was brutal, and a winter that killed 6 head and left them scrambling to make up the loss. She and Silas still had arguments about who'd told who, what, and when, and she still moved faster than he liked sometimes, and he still went quiet in ways she hadn't fully learned to read after 15 years of marriage. Maggie at 12 was genuinely difficult in a way that Clara suspected was karmic. James at 10 had broken his arm falling off a fence he'd been told not to climb and had been entirely unrepentant about it. None of it was smooth. None of it was the story people told afterward, the clean version where the hard parts were compressed, and the years when you were just keeping things going didn't get mentioned because there was nothing remarkable about them. But she'd stopped believing that smooth was the measure of a good life. She'd believed that once, or she'd believed that if she could just get to smooth, she'd know she was safe. She knew now that smooth was weather-dependent and not a destination, and that the actual measure of a good life was something different, whether you'd built things that held, whether you'd been honest about what you were doing and why, whether the people around you were better or worse for your presence. By those measures, she was doing all right. She still kept the account books. She still knew the exact state of every transaction the ranch was involved in, and she still noticed discrepancies before Silas did, and she still wrote letters when letters needed writing. She'd helped, over the years, 5 other families in the valley with debt situations that smelled wrong, sat with their ledgers, read their loan documents, helped them write to whatever institution they needed to write to. Not all of those situations had been fraud. Some of them were just people who'd taken on more than was manageable and needed help understanding the numbers clearly enough to make decisions. She did that too. She did it without charge because it wasn't a business. It was what you did when you knew how to read a ledger and your neighbor didn't. Agnes Aldrich said once, at a kitchen table not unlike Clara's own, that Clara was the most practical idealist she'd ever met. Clara had thought about that for a while. I'm not sure I'm an idealist, she said. You keep doing things that only pay off in the long run, Agnes said. For people who aren't you, that's idealism. That's just how things work, Clara said. If your neighbor fails, the failure eventually reaches you. It's practical. Agnes had given her a look that suggested she was not entirely convinced, and Clara had let it go. She thought about it again, a long time later, sitting on the porch on a summer evening, watching Maggie and James in some kind of argument in the yard, while Silas moved the cattle toward the near pasture, and Hector was somewhere behind the barn doing something that involved hammer sounds. The light was going amber and long, and the mountains were that blue that happened for about an hour before dark, and the ranch was solid around her in every direction. The good roof and the fixed floors and the walls that had been shot at and survived, and the barn with 4 walls that matched. She thought about October, which was never very far from her mind even now. Not with distress. It had faded from the raw thing it had been into something she could examine clearly. She thought about what she'd had and what she'd been and what she'd walked into that street expecting. She'd expected a job. She'd gotten something she couldn't have planned and wouldn't have asked for and couldn't have imagined earning, which was a life that was entirely her own, not assigned to her by circumstance or handed to her by someone else's goodwill, but built stone by stone out of things she'd done. That was the thing about the frontier that nobody in a comfortable place understood. Or maybe the thing about being a woman in particular, or maybe just the thing about being a person who'd started with nothing and knew it. You could not take a good life for granted. You had to make it, deliberately, out of whatever materials were available, and you had to keep making it because it didn't make itself. She'd had 11 cents, and she'd made this. Silas came up to the porch as the light shifted, and he sat in the chair beside her. And they looked at the yard where Maggie had apparently won whatever argument had been happening, and James was walking away with the dignity of a 10-year-old boy who had decided not to pursue the matter. "She's going to be difficult her whole life," Silas said. "She gets it from her father," Clara said. "She absolutely does not. The stubbornness is yours. The moving before thinking is yours. The combination is unfortunate," she agreed. He made a sound that was definitely a laugh. The quiet version he'd always kept close, and the evening moved around them, and somewhere down the valley road there was a rider. Noah, as it turned out, coming home for the week from Missoula, where he was building his practice into something Belle said would outlast both of them. Noah, with his careful mind and his particular gift for sitting with people who'd been robbed of the accurate story of themselves and giving it back to them. She watched him come down the road in the last light, and she thought about what she'd said to him once, when he was 9 years old and standing next to her watching the valley. "You were never mine to keep." She'd meant it then and she meant it now, but it sat differently after 20 years of mornings at the same table and evenings at the same fire and the 100 small ordinary things that added up, over time, to something that didn't have a clean name but was larger than any single word for it. He rode through the gate and she saw him look at the ranch the way he always did when he came back, taking it in, the whole of it, like he was checking that it was still there. It was still there. That was the point. That had always been the point. She'd come to Red Bluff with a letter and 11 cents and a broken boot, and she'd been mocked and turned away and left to sit in the mud. And one man had stepped out of the crowd and offered her honest work, and she'd said yes. And from that single decision they'd built, something that was still standing 15 years later, with all its imperfections and its difficult daughter and its repaired walls and its account books kept in her careful hand. Nobody gave it to her. Nobody's grace had descended on her. She'd made it herself, with Silas, with Noah, with Hector and Tom and Agnes and old Greer and Roy Morrow and all the other people who'd decided, at one point or another, that the thing being built here was worth contributing something to. That was what she wanted to say, if anyone had ever asked her to say it plainly, that the life you build by your own hands, out of honest work and clear eyes, and the willingness to stay when staying is the harder choice. That life is worth more than any life that was arranged for you. Not because arrangement is wicked, but because what you build yourself, you know the structure of. You know where the soft spots are and how you fix them, and you know it will hold because you made it hold, and that knowledge is not something anyone can take from you. They tried, of course. That was the other thing she knew. They tried to take what they hadn't built. And sometimes they succeeded, and sometimes they didn't. And the difference was usually documentation, stubbornness, neighbors who showed up with rifles and lunch pails, and the particular refusal of certain people to accept that being beaten once meant they were finished. She'd been beaten before. Not here. Before here. In the years she didn't talk about much. She'd sat in enough mud, metaphorical and literal, to know what it felt like. And she knew now, from the other side of it, that the mud was not the end of the story unless you decided it was. Noah rode into the yard and swung down off his horse and looked up at the porch. "You're early," Clara said. "Finished what I was doing." He handed the horse off to James, who took it with the dignity of a person trusted with something important. "Is there dinner?" "There's dinner," she said. He came up the porch steps and stood for a moment, the way he always did, looking at the valley and the last of the light. "Still here," he said. He said it the way he'd always said it, a statement of fact that was also something else, something that didn't need a larger word for it. "Still here," she agreed. She got up and went inside to finish dinner, and behind her she heard Silas and Noah start talking, and Maggie's voice from somewhere in the yard, and James asking the horse something in the low, confiding tone he used with animals, and the ranch settled into its evening sounds around her. The particular sounds of a place that had been through things and was still standing. She put the kettle on. She had no complaints.